All right, I've got the task of waking us up after lunch. Hopefully some folks will trickle in. Nice to meet everyone. My name is Stephanie Carlisle. I'm going to introduce this next panel. The final panel is titled Enabling Conditions for Systems Change. And I'm just going to briefly kick off some of the theoretical and conceptual questions that we're going to be hopefully working through in this next hour. So some of the key questions we'll be tackling are, what does it really mean to radically scale up a regenerative bio-based construction economy? What does it mean to reorient the assumptions and blind spots of our current building culture? And can the scale up fundamentally be done in an ethical and just way? I think some folks in the room are architects, or some people listening in are architects, so I thought I might just ground this also a teeny bit, share a little bit of my experience and where I'm coming from with the conversation. So for my whole career as an architect and as a researcher, I've been working on quantifying the environmental impacts of buildings and construction and connecting life cycle assessment data to deeper explorations of material, processes, manufacturing, labor, ecological systems. The guiding premise of this work in the broader community of folks who work on carbon accounting tools is that if designers don't have that information when they're making decisions, that they fundamentally can't design in informed and impactful ways. And that when ecological and social data is not in the room, at the table when decisions are made, that really those conversations about climate impact and environmental justice remain theoretical and disconnected from the day-to-day life and decisions of designers. We've had a lot of conversations the last 2 days about the ethics of practice. And so I think I also just wanted to ground this a little bit in the reality that no architect comes to work every morning trying to specify toxic, harmful, and unjust materials, right? But many of us operate within a system built on hiding externalities in order to assure cost-effective and anonymous exploitation that is fundamental to the work and practice of design and building. We've designed culture that relies on treating materials as undifferentiated commodities and buildings as objects. So the tricky reality is that most architects, contractors, engineers really have no idea where most of the materials they work with come from, the landscapes that they shaped, the labor and systems of exploitation from which they are made. And they have little incentive to climb out of these bounded and isolated ways of thinking and designing that we've been critiquing the past 2 days. I tend to sit mostly on the data and tool side of this equation, but I think we all understand that this isn't principally a technology problem at all. The trouble is that sitting with environmental and social impacts of our own practice is deeply, deeply uncomfortable, especially for a professional community that relies on positive, feel-good storytelling and marketing as a primary form of communication, and also one in which many architects have inherited a narrative of powerlessness in their ability to actually affect very, very large change outside their own projects. But we also know that architecture is made up of individuals. Individuals have agency. The built environment does not build itself, and we do this work every day. We make decisions that have real consequences. So we both love to share case studies of projects where teams have gone above and beyond normative practice to show that it's possible to build differently. We've seen a lot of those the last day or two. But it's also foolish and perhaps counterproductive to think that individuals can reorient industry through some combination of earnestness, panic, shame, goodwill, wishful thinking, and special clients. The work of transformation is community work. It's a work of mutual aid. The change we need is a revolution in the building industry, not a marginal reduction in carbon emissions. So the work both happens one building at a time, and it also seems ludicrous and insufficient to address the climate crisis one building at a time. In the last few years, I've been working on this question of wood sourcing, biogenic carbon accounting, and the tricky task of defining categories like climate smart wood in a way that is both credible and useful. And I offer that as an example because for me, I've learned that the work was completely transformed when it moved out of the dry, abstract nature of carbon accounting, and when I had the opportunity to start working far more closely with forest ecologists, land managers, mill operators, and people who make up this very, very elongated and difficult supply chain. These forms of shared learning and collaboration take time, they're challenging, but they're also satisfying and joyful. And it's really been, for me, the only way to shift from a quantification of harm to a conversation about stewardship. So if we sit with a reality built over the last 2 days of presentations that the foundation of architecture is indeed ethically shaky, to say the best, that it's caused measurable harm, that it continues to do so at an accelerating pace, but also that there is deep desire for change. The question we're left with is, what does it take to make that change happen, right? For designers to extend care and consideration outside of our direct clients and building occupants, to frontline and fence line communities, to broader planetary community. What does it mean to build the infrastructure of accountability and transparency? What is the role of industry, manufacturers, finance, regulation, education, and the whole world that sits outside our computer screens and our desks when we show up every day to do the work? And do we even have incentive structures that support system change? So we'll see if we can cover all of that in the next hour. And with that framing, I want to introduce our first speaker. So Mark Wishney is the Chief Sustainability Officer at BTG Pactual. Mark, BTG Pactual Timberland Investment Group, and where he leads the firm's climate and biodiversity-focused investment practice. Mark previously led the Global Forestry Program at the Nature Conservancy, directed forest restoration research at the Smithsonian Institution, and served as program director for the Yale Tropical Resource Institute. I am so happy that we have Mark here today. I think he's a really, really interesting person in this larger question of forests, and really gets to the heart of all of the complexity, nuance, and hopefully challenges of moving these questions forward. Got some.
Hi, everyone. Thanks very much. Thank you, Stephanie, for the introduction. Thank you, Alan, for the invitation to be here for this incredible couple of days with this incredible group of panelists. Thank you to all the other organizers. I was sending versions of my PowerPoint presentation over during the break. And thanks to everyone for sticking it out through lunch. So I'm going to try and cover, is there an echo? I'm getting an echo back here. You getting an echo back there? Out there? I'm going to try and cover as much as I can. And before I jump in, I just want to give you a couple quick thought experiments. So how many of you had a muffin or toast or pancakes for breakfast this morning? Raise your hands. How many of you had cereal? How many of you had yogurt or cow milk? Okay. How do you all feel? How many people in this room feel positive with the phrase exotic monoculture? Okay. So all of you consumed exotic monocultures for breakfast this morning, right? Wheat is from ancient Sumeria. Cows are Indo-European. If you had a lettuce in your salad at lunch, that's from Europe and Siberia. About 98% of food production in the US is exotic. Almost all of it produced in monocultures. There's a lot of discussions about agriculture. I have a background in the environment community. There's a lot of discussions in the environment community about agriculture, what constitutes sustainable agriculture. And I just want to highlight for a moment that those are incredibly important conversations, not least because agriculture is the driver of over 90% of the world's deforestation, but also because agriculture has all kinds of environmental impacts. But let me ask you all another question. How many people in the room feel that rather than planting wheat in Iowa, which we just established as an exotic monoculture crop, that farmers in Iowa should instead gather seeds of 40 native Iowan grasses and sow them across the fields and manage a diverse mixture of native grass species instead? I won't actually ask you to answer that question. You probably have not thought about that before. But if you thought about it, it probably would be fairly intuitive that, well, those 40 native species, they probably don't grow very fast. They probably don't get as many bushels per hectare as you get of wheat seeds. Probably not all of those grasses are nutritious. Maybe they don't have much protein. Maybe they're not even digestible by humans. So we sort of accept the idea that we want our agriculture to be sustainable. We want agriculture to be organic. We want it to be regenerative. We want farmers to protect streams. We want them to take wildlife into consideration. And so in my experience, the conversations about agriculture are focused on that. They're not focused on the idea that we shouldn't plant a row of wheat or lettuce or potatoes which are not native to Ireland or tomatoes which are not native to Italy. The idea is that we should manage differently, but what we're planting is okay. But if I say exotic monoculture tree farm, if I say eucalyptus in Brazil, there's already been a lot of conversation in the room about how that's not what we want. And it may not be what we want. It may not be. But what I want to highlight for everyone is that we're actually not making a sort of a logical, consistent determination there that exotic monocultures are bad for production. There's something else going on that's informing, I would argue, how we're thinking about wood and forests. And one of the first things I would argue that's going on is that when I talk about agriculture, I don't talk about wheat grasslands. I talk about croplands. I have a different word. If I talk about forests, I only have one word. There's only one word for forest products, right? It doesn't matter if it comes from a natural forest or it comes from a tree farm. There's only one word. There's no distinction between a managed system of forests and a natural system of forests in our lexicon, at least in English. So as part of what I want to talk about here is that there are ideas that are informing our discourse, what we're thinking is possible, what we're thinking is permissible, that we may not be entirely aware of, but those ideas are incredibly powerful. So I'm going to flip through these slides. Almost every image in these slides is from properties, projects that we own and manage. I'm going to touch on, I'm going to talk a little bit about natural climate solutions, which is sort of how in the forestry world, I come from the forest management and restoration side of things. This is where climate and climate smart forest products kind of show up on the forestry side. I'm going to talk about wood consumption, and then I'll talk a little bit about social license. And if there's time, I'll talk a little bit about some of the work that we're doing. And just for a time check, when should I be done with my remarks? Sorry. Okay, all right, I'll do my best. So briefly, 50, okay, thank you. So briefly, just to tell you what my organization is. So BTG Pactual is the largest investment bank in Latin America. We're a Brazilian investment bank. Where I work, the Timberland Investment Group is the second largest institutional timberland investment manager in the world. So we manage about just under 3 million acres of land across the Americas and across the US, in Brazil, Uruguay, and Chile. And we work with institutional investors. So think about large pension funds, insurance companies that manage hundreds of billions of dollars that are allocating money to investments. That's our client base, generally speaking. And so I think a lot about forests, and I think a lot about restoration, and I think about climate, and I think about the potential power of private investment at truly massive scales to make a difference. So I started thinking about, and had my first conversations with Alan and Thomas Robinson and other architects working in mass timber when I was working at the Nature Conservancy, where I led the Global Forestry Program. The Nature Conservancy is, by most measures, the world's largest environmental NGO. 4,000 people active in 100 plus countries. This is the results of a paper that was published by a colleague of mine, also a graduate of the school here, of the forestry school, at the Nature Conservancy, Bronson Griscom, that in 2017 established really for the first time comprehensively the potential of nature, or I would say rather, not just that nature could contribute to addressing the climate crisis, but that it actually had to. So this is showing the potential climate mitigation of different land management practices by 2030. This was published in 2017, so we're over halfway now to 2030. But what it established was that if we maximize the sort of economically efficient, improved management, restoration, and protection of land, grasslands, forests, and wetlands, that we could deliver 30% of the mitigation needed to achieve the Paris Agreement. And that's more than, say, the transportation sector. This paper and others that followed really kind of established natural climate solutions as an idea, as a political priority, in a way that had not existed previously. And what I would highlight is that forests are where the action is. About 75% of the total potential. And that's because they're very carbon dense. It means if we can't protect and restore our forests, then we probably don't have a climate stable future. And almost half of the total opportunity is this first row, which is reforestation. So putting forests back where they once were is the single most powerful natural climate solution available to us. And if we don't find a way to really deliver on that, then we really don't have a path forward to addressing the climate crisis. And of course, this was sort of great news for a lot in the environment community, a lot of folks in the environment community. All the things that we've always wanted to do, protect forests, restore wetlands, we really need to do it. But of course, as we've been talking about, this is a huge challenge because just that green part of that top bar, that's restoring 200 million hectares, 500 million acres of forest in the next 5 years now. That's like doubling the area of timberland in the United States. Again, a land use change like we've never seen before. So in order for natural climate solutions to work, they have to work at a massive scale. And that led me to start thinking about forest products in a different way. Because we've talked a lot about, can this mic be turned on so I can step out in front of the screen? Is that possible? Yeah, okay, great. Can you all hear me all right? So we've talked a lot about the potential climate impact of wood products, and it's true. We've talked about the potential to store carbon, the potential to substitute for more carbon-intensive alternatives. But really, I came at this thinking about how in the world are we going to incentivize reforestation? Where is the demand going to come from that's going to drive capital into landscapes to produce more trees? There's been some discussion about the potential shortage of timber. Well, how are we going to address that? So if we think about carbon over time, and what this is showing is carbon stock. I haven't put an axis there. This is just an example from Brazil of, you could imagine, 20 hectares of land. And this is showing different sources of carbon sequestration and carbon benefit over time. So this, this bottom row, this is a little area of natural forest, which is slowly regrowing over time. And this dark green sawtooth pattern, that's rotational forestry. That's a stand of trees being planted, grown for 20 years, harvested. The carbon stock drops down to zero. It's replanted. It grows again. In practice, you manage many stands. You don't see that sawtooth pattern, but this is one stand of trees. So that's what's happening in the forest. And by the way, when we talk about carbon offset credits, you hear a lot of talk in the media. Carbon offset credits, at this point, only recognize this dark green part and this yellow part. That's the only thing that shows up in the carbon markets. Now, in this case, we're growing those trees on a long rotation. About 40% of what we harvest is the right size and diameter for solid wood products. About half of that actually goes into the final product. And so that shows up here. This is stored carbon. We're assuming decay rates over time using the IPCC standard decay rates. So there's wood entering that harvested wood product pool and leaving. But it's entering more quickly than it's leaving, and so that increases over time. That's carbon stored out of the atmosphere. We've been talking about that already. And then this is substitution. This is a rough estimate, an average from a meta-analysis. But this is using that wood instead of alternative materials, plastic, steel, concrete. And if you stack that up over time, there are a couple of things that are I should have been doing this. Sorry about that. There are a couple of things that become clear. The first is that the benefit of managing forests sustainably and using forest products for carbon-positive applications in replacing more carbon-intensive alternative materials, the benefit of the value chain exceeds the benefit of the forest over time. The second is that, which was very clear to me, is that if we can get this right, then we'll get a lot more of this. Because supply, in many cases, follows demand. Now, it's complicated with forests. And we'll talk a little bit about that. Because forests have multiple sources of supply. You can't go to a natural grassland and harvest wheat. If you want wheat, you have to plant it, and you have to harvest it from an agricultural system. But forests have multiple alternative supplies. So sometimes forestry can be sustainable. Sometimes it can be unsustainable. And sometimes we can get outcomes that we don't want. So it's complicated. But the potential, if we're trying to drive restoration and reforestation at large scales, of increasing demand for the right kinds of products and the right conditions is powerful. So how do we make this happen? And this is, these are some new slides I haven't tried before, so let's see how they go. This is showing renewable energy production, solar and wind, over time, global production. And what I want to highlight here is it starts in 1900, goes to 2017. The first wind turbine was built in 1887, the first functioning photovoltaic cell in 1888. So these are not new technologies. And in fact, we had a little bit of sort of industrial production. But in the 1990s, governments first in Europe, Denmark, and Germany and elsewhere started prioritizing solar and renewable energy production as a climate mitigation tool. It was required as part of portfolio standards. There were incentives for research and development. And what we saw is an increase over time of production. And then finally, when we got to scale, rapid acceleration, still not maybe fast enough, but rapid acceleration because it became cost competitive. When government started taking action here, solar power and wind power was really expensive. So this wasn't an obvious choice. This is a big political choice. It took real political will. There had to be constituents pressuring politicians to take this kind of action. So the challenge is one of the important challenges is we think about enabling conditions, and I think the other panelists are going to talk about, there are a lot of things that have to happen for this all to take off. But if we're going to see politicians and the public advocate for rapidly increasing consumption of wood products, of timber, they have to be confident that doing so is a good thing. I hosted an event while I was in the Nature Conservancy together with the Forest Service and Bank of America in New York City on the top of they're building their beautiful space. We had a bunch of real estate developers and investors, and we were talking about mass timbers 7-8 years ago. And almost every question that we got from the room was some version of, okay, look, it seems really cool, but if I build a high-rise in Midtown Manhattan tomorrow, and I put in, I'm exaggerating here, but I put in, LED lights, I can get a LEED bronze rating, and I'll be congratulated. If I build it out of wood, I'm going to be attacked for deforesting the Amazon. And that was powerful because that actually inhibits action, right? People don't know or are concerned about the perception that timber harvest equals deforestation. This is, just to put a little bit of data around that, this is the total global area of tropical deforestation, of commodity-driven deforestation over a 15-year period, 72 million hectares. This is the area of planted forests over that same period, of new planted forests at the same time, almost the same, just by coincidence. Actually, planting offset a lot of deforestation. About 2.5% of that planting appears to have occurred as a replacement for forest. Most planted forests are planted in places that were deforested for agriculture. Most deforestation is caused by agriculture. So at a general level, the consumption of timber, it can cause degradation, it can cause other impacts. It's not a driver of deforestation globally. Sure, in cases, but it's not a principal driver. The details matter. We've had a lot of conversations about local sourcing, knowing where your wood comes from, and that is obviously critically important. But the concern doesn't quite match the reality. We also know there's a number of studies. This is one from the US. I will show an example in Brazil if I have time, but rising timber revenue promotes not just planting of new forests, but it also promotes higher forest productivity, more investment in forests. And that's been shown in many places around the world. Where you have conditions of poor governance, where you have conditions of unclear ownership or ungoverned commons, increasing timber revenue can drive degradation and deforestation, right? Because it's essentially mining a public resource. But where you have good governance, where you have clear rules of tenure, actually the outcomes are what you would expect for anything else. As beef consumption increases, more cattle pasture is created in Brazil. As it decreases, more, or as prices decline, there's more natural regeneration. We can see these pulses across the landscape. So these same patterns affect forests. Because forests are a more complex set of distinct ecosystems, the impacts are more variable, more complex, but it's the same drivers. Let me do this. I'll skip through this one. And this is just to give an example of what this looks like in Brazil. So this is Mato Grosso do Sul, Brazil. It's a part of Mato Grosso do Sul, Brazil. size of France. And all of these gray shapes, these are all planted tree farms. This is eucalyptus exotic monocultures. Okay? Most of it certified as sustainable by either FSC or the SFI equivalent in Brazil. But the point I want to make here is twofold. So first, we know, because there's very good satellite imagery available for Brazil, we know that almost 100% of these tree farms were planted on old cattle pasture. And we know that almost 100% of that cattle pasture used to be forest 30 years ago. So we know that almost none of these tree farms actually drove deforestation. What else do we know? Well, there are about 1.4 million hectares, about 3.05 million acres of tree farms in Mato Grosso do Sul. That's the size of the state of Connecticut. And they were all established since 2006. So in 15 years. It's a huge area. And why? Well, because of 3 pulp mills that were built. There's demand, and so supply had to respond. And along with all those tree farms, we know in Brazil that for every roughly 3 hectares of tree farms, we have 2 hectares of protected and restored natural forest. So we know that actually the total impact of those planted forests is, or tree farms is potentially much greater. And so why all this eucalyptus going in Brazil? Well, we talked about, do we want monoculture tree farms? It's a good question. Why do people want them? It's probably for the same reason that people plant wheat and not mixtures of native species. The planted forest in Brazil, there's about 10 million hectares of planted forest in Brazil. For reference, there's about 90 million hectares of agriculture, about 170 million hectares of cattle pasture. The ag and cattle pasture, almost all of it used to be forest. There's 10 million hectares of planted tree farms, so a tiny area. That's 2% of global forest area, those 10 million hectares. That 2%, those 10 million hectares, provide 12% of the world's wood. Incredibly productive. These trees grow faster than trees anywhere else in the world for a variety of reasons. So that's why they're produced there. And the question is, as we're thinking about where our wood is going to come from, how do we want to produce it, and what are the trade-offs that we want to accept? And we're going to need to produce more. So there's been a lot of conversation about demand for construction. This is FAO data. They put out forecasts of future wood consumption periodically. This is from 22, I think. So the projection is that consumption of primary wood products is going to increase, which is the blue, by 37% by 2050. It's a massive amount. And they have, for the first time actually in the last forecast, they included mass timber and cellulosic fiber as 2 sort of elements of the bioeconomy that might develop. There are some papers that have been published by eminent researchers that forecast more mass timber consumption than this. But this is sort of a conservative estimate. But if you assume some growth in the bioeconomy that we're all talking about, we're talking about a 50% increase in forest product consumption, primary forest product consumption. And that wood has to come from somewhere. And in fact, if we want to see more of like the bioeconomy grow, if we want to continue to replace fossil materials, then we need even more of that. And I would argue that if we get it right, we want as much consumption as we can get, because if we can get it right, and we won't get it right everywhere, of course, but if we get it right, we can drive reforestation and restoration at truly significant scales. So we get not just the storage and the substitution, but also the sequestration out in the landscape. We get biodiversity. We get all kinds of other benefits as well. So this is just a direct illustration of that kind of challenge that we see. This is a study from 2017 from North America. So this is a survey of 1,300 environmentally aware adults. Asked a whole lot of questions. The first question was, which is the most renewable material? They were given 4 choices: wood, plastic, steel, and concrete. Almost 4 out of 5 said wood is the most renewable material. And renewable is it's not just it doesn't just mean that we can reuse it or that it's something we can produce again. It's a very positive word, right? It's an optimistic word. It's a word with which we have all kinds of associations. That's why we call it renewable energy and not low carbon energy. But when the same respondents were asked to describe the forest sector and asked whether any of these terms describe the sector that produces that product, not even 1 in 5 said environmentally responsible, sustainable, socially responsible, innovative. And there are reasons for that, right? As a participant in the sector, I would say some are justified, some are not justified, but it doesn't really matter, because that gap in social license, that's the obstacle that's going to prevent even, in my view, the right kind of sustainable, just, sourced, and produced wood products from being supported and embraced. So I'll just talk a little bit. I didn't think I was going to go quite as quickly as I did, which is great. So I will talk a little bit about some work that we're doing. I mean, as we think about this challenge of social license as a business, we see this as frankly a nice, very fortuitous convergence of enlightened self-interest. There are things that we can do that we think are good for the world that are also, if we're successful, will help us build our business. And so it allows us to put some resources into it. But we think about a few different approaches to building that social license. The first is, as I said, that we have to accept, and there are histories of conflict and debate between the forest sector, the environment community, local communities, indigenous peoples, not always all on opposite sides, sometimes in different groupings. But there are long contentious histories here. But we need to accept that whether we think that they are justified or not, this is the reality that we're trying to change. And we're not going to change by convincing everybody that we were right. We're going to change by accepting that this is our starting point and do what work we can to actually address this gap. And so there are a couple elements to that. The first is that we think that the forest industry needs to lead on sustainability and on responsible development. We don't think, it doesn't make sense for us to just sort of follow along resisting regulation or follow along resisting pressure through certification systems or from civil society organizations. We think we actually need to pick up the baton and demonstrate that we are a responsible industry. And when I say demonstrate, it means not just leading when it comes to policy, when it comes to rulemaking, but then demonstrating on the ground actual tangible examples of how we can do our work better. We need to find collaborations. We need to work with others who have a shared interest, who can tell parts of this story with more credibility than we can, who can tell parts of this story that they understand better than we understand. And if we do that and we build the right coalitions, then we think that because we're all facing this shared urgency to address climate change, because it's clear that nature needs to play a role, and because the scale at which nature needs to play a role, in our view, requires financing at truly large scales, then the responsible forest sector needs to play a significant role. So I'll just talk a little bit about some of the work that we're doing and then hand it off. So we, in 2021, we announced a collaboration with Conservation International, which is one of the large international environmental organizations. And we said we were going to mobilize $1 billion for investment in Latin America in a program that would be 50% commercial tree farms and 50% forest restoration and protection, 2.5 times what's required by law. And the contention was that if we did that, we would be able to demonstrate material benefits, significant tangible benefits for biodiversity, for water, and other environmental values. But because we had commercial tree farms, we'd also be able to demonstrate tangible benefits for communities through increased economic activity of various kinds. We also said that in this program, we were going to plant our trees, we were going to manage our trees, and we were also going to invest in primary production facilities. So we were going to grow our trees on long rotations, grow large diameter logs that we can use for solid wood products, and we were going to invest in sawmills and plywood mills, primary manufacturing facilities, so that we could direct what we produce towards climate positive end use applications, which we also think are applications that are product classes that are likely to have increased demand. So all of these photos that I'm going to show you, except for the ones on the left, are either from this specific investment program. The middle photo is our first actual investment, or from our property. So all of those photos are not stock photos. They're all photos from our properties. So this is the first investment that we made. It's a property. We're not very creative on naming. We're called the Timberland Investment Group. This property is called Project Alpha. Guess what the next property was called? Project Alpha, first of all, we're talking about scale. So this green area is the size of the island of Manhattan. This property is 4 times that size. The first thing we had to do when we acquired it was remove 600 kilometers of fencing. When we bought it, this was the land use. The green is natural forest. The yellow is cattle pasture. This property complied with the law. It's about 27% natural vegetation. Together with Conservation International, we came up with a land use plan. We said on this property, this first property, we're not going to do 50-50. That's our portfolio target. This property, we're going to do 40-60. More tree farms. It's closer to market. It's more productive. So we have only 3,000 hectares to restore. Only 7,000 plus acres to restore. Let me pause for a moment and just say a word about restoration. I started my career as a restoration ecologist, as a scientist studying restoration for the Smithsonian. I ran the Global Forestry Program for the Nature Conservancy. I've consulted on large-scale restoration projects over the years throughout Latin America. Restoration at scale is vanishingly rare. It's rare, it's impermanent, it almost never takes. So this 7,000 acres on this property we're located, by the way, in the Brazilian Cerrado, which is a seasonally dry ecosystem. It's about a quarter of Brazil. And Brazil is larger than the continental United States, so this is a huge area. That 7,000 acre restoration project, which is just our starting point, is the largest known restoration project in the Cerrado. So just to give a sense of scale, this is part of what we're talking about, is actually delivering at scale. But the question was, where do we restore and for what purpose? If we're gonna do 3,000 hectares. And so Conservation International's conservation science team and our forestry team sat down together, and this was like the most exciting for me, maybe part of the project so far. And over a period of weeks, they came up with this map. And they said, well, Conservation International said, well, listen, the 2 opportunities on this property are watershed health and connectivity. We've lost about 14% of the Amazon rainforest, which is a tragedy. We've lost about 50% of the Cerrado. And what remains is in private land. So it's a highly fragmented landscape. So they said, well, look, by law, these riparian corridors need to have buffers of natural vegetation of 30 meters, and the property largely had that. They said, first, let's put 400-meter buffers on these riparian systems, 200 meters to either side, 4 football fields across, 7 times legal requirements. That will really improve water quality, aquatic habitat, all kinds of other values, but that's also wide enough. It should serve as a corridor to allow wildlife from this patch of remnant forest to move through this corridor up to this new large contiguous area of restoration that we're going to execute, and that then connects to this patch of natural forest on our neighbor's property, so that 3,000 hectares of restoration can deliver 10,000 hectares of connected and restored habitat. And this is what it looked like 12 months later. So this is the view from Google Earth. That's the corner of that green patch of protected forest. This is that riparian system. You can see there was gallery forest around there. And this is what it looked like. About 12 months later, you can see we put our fire breaks in place, and it's starting to green up. This is what the tree farms look like. Why do people plant eucalyptus? Well, you plant it in part because of this. So this is the property, not a lot of trees, also not a lot of cows, very low productivity. And this is what it looks like now. So far, we've planted about 12 million trees, eucalyptus trees on the property. And this is, again, why we plant trees. One of the common criticisms of tree planting as a climate solution is you plant a tree today, it takes 20 years before it starts to sequester carbon. Well, that's 90 days after planting. They're kind of little bushes. Mostly they're growing their roots. This is our chief forester on the property. He's also the photographer for a lot of these pictures. He's an amateur photographer. This is 14 months later. They're over 30 feet tall. They're about twice that tall now at 25 months. And there's almost as much going on below ground as there is above ground. So this is a massive amount of carbon sequestered very, very quickly. This is also a lot of economic value. And by the way, the tree farms effectively subsidize the protection of the restored areas. That's what allows us to keep fire out, to protect those restored areas and allow them to regrow. We had 9 full-time employees on the property when we acquired it. It doesn't take a lot of people to run a marginal cattle ranch. We have 222 full-time employees, all formally employed, all receiving full benefits, all are on average earning just over 2 times minimum wage. And we expect by the time we're done deploying the strategy to have generated as much as 9,000 new full-time jobs in rural places. This is Project Alpha. these are capybaras on the river. They're expected to benefit from the wide open areas. They have about the best chance imaginable, except when that dad is. So the world's third largest cat can't have parents. This is the edge of actually regenerating food. They also how to feed about a meter and a quarter tall. Actually, they're great. We have so far identified over 500 species, almost entirely intact to autoscale. So we know not just the general benefit we're trying to create, but we also know specifically we doubled the habitat available for this strategy. And part of this also is the strategic communications. So we're proud of what we're doing. There's plenty of room for people to have other ideas about what we should do. There's plenty of room for us to do better. But we committed very early on to be very public about what we're doing. And so together, this is actually a piece that Conservation International wrote on their blog. They're on their website, one of their blog posts. They've done a couple, but we've done a lot of sort of joint strategic communications about the project. And I love this framing because in a sense, it kind of sums up why we are working together. But this is the idea. So maybe we don't like exotic monocultures. Maybe we don't like eucalyptus. Maybe there is another way to approach things. But I would argue that there's a role, just like there's a role for wheat fields and cornfields in feeding people. There's a role for highly productive planted forests, which, by the way, I skipped over this, now represent more than 50% of the wood we consume. More than 50% of our wood globally is from planted forests, up from a third in 2000. So this is a rapidly accelerating portion of the wood mix. There's a role for all kinds of management. There are forests which should be protected. There are forests which can be managed sustainably. There are places where planting rows of the same thing over and over again, I would argue, is a perfectly appropriate use if done in the right ways. And if we do it in the right ways and with the right kind of intentionality, we can deliver not just low carbon products, employment, but we can also deliver biodiversity restoration at scales that otherwise, to my knowledge, in the regions in which we work, have never before been achieved. So that is our mission. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Mark. Next we have David Lewis. David Lewis is a principal of LTL Architects, professor of architecture at Parsons School of Constructed Environments. David pursues fundamental transformations in the discipline of architecture brought about by regenerative material systems to address climate change. At Parsons, he served as the dean of the school and has been on the faculty since 2002. Marking 25 years of practice, the principals of LTL Architects have refocused their practice to re-embrace and expand carbon sequestering materials through the seduction of architectural representation.
Very pleased to be able to follow Mark, particularly in thinking about system change in one level, and now changing to system change in architectural education. And one of the most vital and critical aspects of this conference, and thank you, Alan, is calling attention to the need to change practices quickly and with clarity from extractive models to regenerative systems. Given the dominance of industrialized material practices over the last 200 years, it should come as no surprise that our current architectural model of architectural education, American model of architectural education, is still deeply rooted in practices born from and underwritten by fossil fuel consumption. While there have been significant changes here at Yale and elsewhere, due in many ways to the collective work of the Carbon Leadership Forum, Architecture 2030, conferences like this, we are far from regenerative architecture pedagogy is commonplace. Our system of architectural education is enshrined in approved curriculums cultivated over decades of the primacy of form generation, spatial exploration, centered in the design studio. Material choices, their health, and social and environmental consequences do not yet hold necessary primacy, with key construction technology and structures courses organized typically around concrete, steel, and sometimes wood. That is what the profession and accredited professional education assumes. A quick peek into studio waste streams after final reviews is very telling and revealing. As educator, practitioner, and recent dean of Parsons School of Constructed Environments, I've been advocating for change, moving from the legacy of modernism to regenerative design practices. My colleagues and I sought, with some success, for example, to institute a dumpsterless design studio culture. We, of course, need to change all these systems quickly, yet inducing rapid system change in the education of an architect raises a series of paradoxes that I would like to tease out and hopefully provide relevance for thinking through system change in other fields and endeavors. The paradox of time. There is no question that limited time frames our urgency, and that the upfront load places material practices in an often uncomfortable but transformative spotlight. Echoing the writings of Yuval Noah Harari, we especially need our educational institutions now to be strong, vocal, and self-correcting mechanisms. Yet the necessary speed to be forces for self-correcting in climate runs headlong into the very durability, continuity, and legacy that underwrites institutions and their capacity to be respective voices. One way past this paradox is to think of change as multi-layered. What can be done now? What can be implemented immediately and reverberate through the system? What requires multi-year planning? And what slow, stable structures can be changed meaningfully enough? This raises the second paradox, the paradox of substitution. The quickest change is swapping something out, replacing one component of a system or a material for a better one. But how far can this go? And does the substitution model paradoxically stabilize and allow the dominant toxic system to persist even longer? Using mineral wool, or better yet, wood fiber corrects from nails of polyurethane spray foam, but is the apparent regenerative solution an unwitting co-conspirator, deflecting attention away from meaningful systemic change? This is an issue in education where the relative ease to create new programs or minors, or offer sustainable or regenerative design degrees or courses to fill gaps and meet demand may in fact do the exact opposite, unless they are conceived as centralized catalysts, incubators to have impact that can be measured throughout the system. The answer, of course, is in data. The accuracy and empirical data is essential to underwrite change, build policy, drive research, and evaluate the complexity of the whole system, and to see it in a new light. The paradigm change of embodied carbon is one exemplar. Yet I'm concerned that the pursuit of this information can distract, if not derail, its intended utility. In this sense, perfection, or the perfection of data, becomes the enemy of the good. The complexity of data-driven discourses can generate solipsistic pursuits untethered from their original goals, or easily overwhelm and numb educators, students, practitioners, builders, and developers trying to use the data. While less precise, translating data into common sense practices corrected and informed, again by that data, may be more effective in underwriting change at scale. Yet, as we all know, the data paints a damning picture of our future if we continue in our current practices. Shouldn't this be sufficient to induce system change? If we can just convince everyone about how terrible it will be, then change will happen, right? But continue leading with catastrophe, especially now when it is a lived condition, can overwhelm the agency and students, staff, and faculty, and may become paradoxically a self-fulfilling prophecy. Denial, willful ignorance, deflection, or resignation are, in this sense, coping mechanisms. What is missing in this narrative of structural change within the discourse of architectures is in many ways the opposite of doomsday. It is also somewhat intangible, hard to calculate, enveloping and enduring. I want to argue here that an effective agent of change is that of seduction, of delight, of beauty and health. Indeed, a most compelling motivation embodied by the practice of architecture and design is the making visible of a different future, one that galvanizes, compels, and seduces through the imagination. If our current conundrum stems in part from pedagogies of disembodied abstraction enabled by modern industrialized processes, then we can correct the challenges brought by static materials of our practice by a different material-based practice. This means centering regenerative relations in pedagogy and deriving the unexpected, the delightful, the new out of reuse and biogenic and geogenic sources, not just substitution. But here's the paradox in this formulation. The legacy profession of the architect, as distinct from the builder or craftsman, is defined through a detachment from a direct engagement with materials, enabled by drawings, scripting ideas, marshalling, and compelling information. As such, the imperative that the role of seduction extends is translated through representational mediums, and that direct engagement of biogenic material research and play is folded back into future architectural education and in an expanded definition of the role of practice. Our recently published Manual of Biogenic House Sections is organized and intended to facilitate this change in schools of architecture and in offices. The 55 built houses selected for the book demonstrate that work with reuse, carbon sequestering, and low carbon materials can indeed create new and exceptional projects. And they are not in some distant future. They're now. Organized by reuse and by materials, each chapter foregrounds nonlinear material practices, visualizes production, illustrates application and techniques, and uses one-point section perspectives to seduce and draw one into the interplay between experience and material invention, uniquely legible in the section, followed by a data evaluation and legible construction concepts. In parallel to the book, to further demonstrate and explore the transformative capacity of regenerative materials to rethink architectural paradigms and conventional programs, we have developed and represented a number of prototype projects. Right? What if the ubiquitous, inexpensive, round straw bale, a residual waste product of seed and grain monoculture, becomes the basis for the design of an early education center? Each bale could connect to a reciprocal timber structure. The resulting ring-beam oculus would form a skylight in the center. Prefabricated timber plumbing packages complement and connect classrooms in pairs with representations underscoring the material practices over time and in cycles, and reinforce the relational connection to site, culture, and context. Following a similar logic, what would happen if we started with a square bale? Architectural delight coming from material play, embracing, in this case, thickness, offers a compelling path for animating future change. The intersection of regenerative material systems, coupled with their health, diversity, impacts, is the story to tell. But it will have more potency when conveyed seductively by practitioners, educators, and students. Thank you.
Next, I would welcome up Daniel Ibanez. Daniel is the director of the Institute for Advanced Architecture in Catalonia. He is an architect, urbanist, and scholar, and the co-founder and principal of Urban Tree. I'm not going to read your whole educational background in the interest of time, but turn it over to you to present on the design-industrial nexus. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bring me in. I feel a little bit they have imposter syndrome because there's so much expertise and talent. So I'm trying to show them good stuff. But they're trying to do something which is very, very important in this agenda. Some of them may be initial, some others a little bit naive, some others maybe more developed, but all in all, I'm trying to really contribute to this crisis that we have. So, but in a way, it's also an excuse to talk about, I think, a paradigm shift, which is how architecture starts to engage with the value chain. How all of a sudden, all my best friends are forced engineers and forced economists. And when I was in school of architecture, I didn't know what forced engineering was. And so I think this is also a small kind of like detail of how this value chain paradigm is somehow so basically what I will in a way try to do is in a way showing how design within the constraints of planetary boundaries necessitates a fundamental departure from this externality laden architectural paradigms and starting to kind of like embrace in a way this idea of the value chain. The value chain that goes from, in this case, in my work, for the forest to buildings, but also to any other value chain that deals with bio-based and regenerative. Probably the most important thing is that we have considered for a very long time now the profession architecture almost as a kind of, as it happens in a vacuum, in a kind of like a isolation. We've often treated it as an isolated endeavor, disconnected from the material, ecological, and industrial network that sustains. But we know that buildings are not occur in a vacuum, as many of the previous podcasts already portrayed. Instead, they are part of a highly integrated kind of like system that one must acknowledge and actively design with. So I think this is particularly important when the embedded footprints, as we were showing just before, are as important, if not exceeding the emphasis or the overemphasis in our discipline on investments of operational energy. So what I would like to do in this very, very short period of time is just to offer 6 strategies. The subtitle of this conference, even though I got it wrong, because at some point it was changed. Anyways, I will concentrate a little bit more on the picture of the two. I want to offer 6, again, very preliminary, but 6 that have been really informing our work. I will try to explain it very quickly with a few examples of some of the stuff that we have been doing in Spain. So the first one is this one, the idea of as a kind of precondition to start designing together with the value chains to visualize it, to really understand its ramifications and go link basically sources with sinks and transformation kind of like contributions. And I think this is, particularly important as well on the idea as well that, all the kind of, big data, digital tools, and data-driven analytics will help us very much to really inform every step that we take along. The second idea, the second strategy is this idea of regenerative, that is so important for in the context of this symposium. Basically going from this narrative legend to the narrative architectural kind of product. The starting logic of that underpins conventional architectural production, now we also must transition towards the framework that brings the great material flows and circular ecological networks. So this shift requires many things. I'll show one example that we just completed in Barcelona. This is, I think, a good, let's say, preliminary example of how to start, going towards a more internalized form of architecture, one that speaks about these preliminary aspects. This is a social housing building that we just completed in Barcelona, 40 apartments. This is the tallest building of mass timber building in Spain, kind of like recently. And we felt it was kind of like relevant, again, almost a prototype of what is about to come. There are several things that makes this project, I think, interesting from that perspective. First of all, it's parking, building with no parking, trying to minimize the amount of CO2 that goes to the foundation. On the concrete of the building, the structure is, operating close to like 900 kilos of tons of equivalent. And we try to make also an architecture that speaks that it's not just about substituting the materiality of the wall, but really trying to have an expressive architecture that will convey this kind of like critical moment and the change that is required somehow in architecture. So you see here very quickly from the rendering to some of the completion schemes to the complete, let's say, structure of the building, how this I'll scroll this very quickly, but obviously this points to several changes. The idea of how the building all of a sudden is industrialized, how we have to fight very hard to bring the material also from local industries in Spain. Obviously, the Central European industries are very strong and much more mature, and we compete very aggressively in the Spanish context. In this case, we were able to kind of convince, in this case, the promoters, the developers of the project to really, build species. A few videos of how this really works, how assembled. It enabled to reduce as well time of construction by 30% in the current housing crisis that Spain is facing was particularly relevant. The other thing about this framework, we think it's interesting from this idea of the regenerative architectural paradigm is that in addition to to also incorporate on the rooftop a greenhouse for food production for the dwellers of the building. Even though it might seem a relatively small device, we have calculated that this could produce basically all the vegetables that are needed for basically for a yearly diet on the residents, as long as they are not. It's a much more some of the and how we think that because of where the material came from, the process that follow this idea of incorporating all the programs that makes building less somehow a destination of consumption and also become a little bit productive, like to be a carbon storing artifact. Third one is this idea of downscaling that might seem a little bit also obvious and naive, but we have been trying to do an effort on using this kind of globalized madness that happens also with material specification. So, most of the work that we do, we try to really understand what is available, what are the kind of notice stream in a dust, say like more fuel from the forest at this point is almost like a bomb waiting to kind of like explode. So this somehow is helping us to create all the value chain again, all the agents in the industry to try to accelerate that. So this video that we have in the screen, I think it's very good. We did this together with Alan and an exhibition that I'll show in a minute. That basically tries to, in very simple terms, kind of like visualize what it takes the material, that's the entire transformation from the forest to the mill, to the kind of factory transportation, and how this tree photograph or recorded with that kind of like GoPro, kind of like material scale, made it all the way to kind of like our store. So for us, it's very important to start understanding that it's one of the ways to reduce strategies, try to reduce this highly globalized kind of value. What we're seeing on the screen is, again, as I was mentioning, a project that celebrated the creation of Mass Madera, which is a multi-stakeholder network to really try to push and accelerate the construction of mass timber in Spain. We have the luxury of intervening at the Youth Underworld Pavilion as a way of celebrating this network and activating it. So again, it was a project developed together with Jose, Alan, and the Institute of Here we wanted to kind of like make a statement in a very charged architectural style. Barcelona Pavilion. And the whole idea here was to really try to get a kind of Leibnizian museum, anything against modernism. We have some issues with the way materials were used in modernity and the kind of lack of radical reflection on the kind of material quality that enabled that to be built. So in this case, high language continuity, but a radical material departure for this kind of like. For us, it was also very important that these are also prototypes that are closer to the citizens, so people can experience and have a one-on-one kind of relation. This project, in a way, was a trigger moment that sort of has enabled this, enabling a radical change in Spain. One of the beautiful things, and I saw Rosa here, is Rosa was also part of this beautiful project, that we managed to also create these nutritional stickers for the materials of the pavilion. Kind of like CO2 would have this kind of like very visual representation of the kind of things that the pavilion required, and they were using certain materials versus the ones that we use. And all of this, as I was mentioning, what has created this network that is fourth point, I have 3 more to go. This is the idea of materializing. Yesterday, the logo, friend with whom we wrote the urbanism book, and has this beautiful kind of like diagram that he says that in a way we should also be materialized architecture. We have been specifying architecture for considering the operational footprints of construction, and we have not taken care of the kind of embedded ones. So in a way, this is pointing to a larger change in paradigm in my view as a strategy that is this idea of going towards a kind of more non-materiality architecture. One, like the evidences we're seeing there, like the materials would start being, the structures would start being the interior, the finish could be the horizontal kind of diaphragms, could be the fortitude, could be even the kind of window frame. So basically, trying to not only build with shorter or smaller value chains, but put them as well with, let's say, less value chains. The ones that are highly symbiotic and regenerative. Another quick example of a project that I think hopefully visualizes this well. As part of the Institute of Architecture of Catalonia, we basically are located in Barcelona, that is the city that you see on the other side of the image. But we also are very lucky to own 130 hectares forest. This time in comparison with the amount of forest that we have, but we have our little kind of forest there. We have a campus that we basically try to kind of like in a way educate the next generation of architects to start dealing with these important topics. So every year we end up the kind of master program we run there. We So in a way, how we are also trying to change pedagogy and how we're trying to change the way we teach our students is that instead of just drawing and specifying, our students go to the forest, select the trees, harvest them, dry them out, cut them, then leave them. They do basically pretty much the entire kind of like process. So it's a way of reducing this value chain to a kind of like small institutional kind of like building and try to replicate that so our students really know how to intervene in each of these so I always like to discuss always what is the footprint of your building on these areas, the relation between the form of extraction of material, of resources and the form of consumption is less than 500. So here are all the students, this is one of the places that I live. There was a whole effort of really trying to do pretty much with the finds that we have in kind of like enforcement. I like very much the singing, because in a way it speaks that with one material or this kind of normal vegetation we can bring pretty much to plus my way to all that. Last 2 points very quickly. When I speak about monomateriality, obviously monomateriality does not mean we just remove genetic timber or let's say one species, but try to implement this idea of multiple species of trade, because as we were saying in Denmark, demand in many cases also drive the way of course the kind of trade. I always love this ubiquitous slide from the high school here in New that Lisa kind of like did as a great example of how through the specification of multiple species we can affect in a way the forest. No? So we do this idea of kind of biodiversifying, having less genetic food, less genetic food, and have more species. Also, taking not only planted forest, but also secondary forest. One quick example that is connected to the project that I shared before in New Zealand Pavilion was this kind of like CLT panel that we did try to combine multiple species. It's a way of saying that even construction commodities as a CLT, we also start incorporating other species that is in the case of strain not just so here we intervene in the most probably famous wall in the history of architecture, that is this famous wall of Roy, and we try to extract these kind of like patterns and these geological patterns and in a way translate them into kind of like this kind of bio-based kind of like version. So geometrically speaking, we're entering a dialogue that again we are capturing these highly diverse and lastly, the idea as well of, in a way, biodiversify. We put sometimes much of emphasis on the bio-base, but I think the urban model matters as much as anything else. We know that the more dense we do our urban environments, the better from an ecological perspective is a general statement, but true to a certain kind of degree. So, having also very interested on trying to understand ways into this idea of redensifying and creating both a kind of like simultaneously a safe flow of CO2. So lastly, this is the last project I want to show on that kind of area. It's the new headquarters for our own institute for architecture that we recently won a concession. They're giving us these 2 beautiful warehouses in Regenerative of Barcelona. We install our new facilities, and because certain setbacks and so on. We are proposing these kind of like large vertical extensions of the mass timber that we hope that is going to be a good example of some of these kind of regenerative. So in here is also the interesting kind of dialogue between the existing, the kind of old, the kind of like building with this kind of like new, kind of like a skeleton or this bio-based skeleton that is somehow. And just to wrap up, I took this beautiful slide from Alan, because we put a lot of emphasis on the bio-base, but again, probably need to combine both density and the bio-base as a way. So then just to wrap up, I think that again, achieving a regenerative architecture necessitates the embedding of design within this expanded value kind of like chain.
Associate Professor of Sustainable Construction at Helta University's Department of Architecture. His research is focused on climate impacts and circular economy in the built environment, as well as the development of new building materials and methods. During his work with the Ministry of the Environment in Finland, Kuitunen developed a national whole building lifecycle assessment method and initiated the Nordic Bauhaus program. Turn it over. Thank you, Matti.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and thank you for inviting me. It's been a really inspiring 2 days that I have had the chance to sit here and listen to the presentations. This is the last presentation, and as a disclaimer, I should say that this is not going to include any nice photographs of cool architectural projects. I'm going to talk about politics and policies, and it's going to be a little bit boring. But on the other hand, boring is the new black, right? Or at least we can approach it like that. So I'm going to talk about planetary boundaries and how we should adjust international policies and how we, building designers and creative professionals, could or even should try to influence politics and politicians at this very critical time in human history. So it's obviously no-brainer to any of us that architecture and construction does not happen in a vacuum. It happens in the context of very rapidly changing political landscape. So in my speech, I will be talking about 3 different aspects that are related to the planetary boundaries and construction, and on the other hand, to policies. But I would like to start, however, from physics and from classical mechanics, namely the free-body problem. The free-body problem is something that is related to 3 or more objects of roughly similar mass that are circling each other. And the problem side here is that there's no mathematical solution of predicting where these objects are going to be as a function of time. If we just have 2 objects circling around each other like Earth and the Moon, we can very accurately calculate where they're going to be 1,000 years now or so. But for 3 or more bodies, there's no way of knowing that. It's a fuzzy, chaotic system. Okay, that's nice to know, but how on earth is that related to the speech? Well, I'm suggesting that in the construction ecosystem and in the construction sector, we are about to enter something which is also a free-body problem. Namely, these 3 bodies, in my view, are that, first of all, we would need to figure out how to develop 2 billion new homes during the century for the growing global population. Then secondly, we should preserve 30% of land and sea area for nature by 2030. And on top of that, we ought to cut 80 or 90% of the greenhouse gas emissions of the construction sector. So these 3 things, in my view, and you could add many more, but these 3 things, in my view, are leading us into a fuzzy, chaotic system. We do not know how advances or lack of advance in either of these fronts would influence the other. And how is that going to influence our profession? So let's start from the need to house 3 billion more people. Well, currently, we are seeing an interesting trend. Here, on the left-hand side, we can see the per capita floor areas in different countries. We can see that there's a huge range from the 80 or so square meters in Australia to under 10 in many of the least developed countries. So people are living on rather different densities, but what's maybe even more interesting is on the right-hand side. And this graph depicts the average floor area per capita growth and development in different areas. And of course, we can't see the small figures, but all of these that show increasing trends are actually countries in which the population growth are strongest. So there are more people who are living in larger apartments. And I would say that this is fair, just for the sake that these are the least developed countries and people should have the right to build their way out of poverty. And I think it's more than fair that if there's a family, say 2 adults, maybe 4 or 5 kids, and maybe a couple of grandparents, that they would have 2 rooms instead of 1. But all this leads into increasing amount of resources, of course. When there are more people who need to have a safe and sound home and who would need to have the basic human needs in that home. So more resource use. And as a result of that, actually at the moment, the consumption of materials and resources for construction is growing faster than the global population. So there is a super linear ratio. And that's why, for addressing these facts, I would suggest that what we should do is to stop looking only at how much resources are consumed by per 1 unit of floor area, like how much energy or carbon or materials are consumed per 1 square meter or 1 square foot of floor area. Instead, we should be looking at how much is there per capita. What is the budget? And this would have to be dealt out, of course, in a fair manner, so that those who have sufficiently or too much should carry most of the burden in decreasing the consumption, whereas those who lack basic necessities should be given possibility of, making their lives a little bit more comfortable or at least safe. And the organization to look for when it comes then to policy development would be, in my view, the Intergovernmental Panel for Buildings and Climate. Now, this is a new organization. It was officially inaugurated in Baku last November in the COP29 climate conference. And this is chaired by France, Kenya, and Brazil. And this is maybe the highest umbrella organization who could try to steer construction sector and building sector and housing towards the planetary boundaries. And why I'm bringing it up here is that even though the already published working program here isn't maybe the most ambitious one, but still, if we have, and I'm certain that we have connections to politicians and those who can make decisions, our possibility would be to try to influence these people who are either participating into this work or who are providing information for the decision makers who are sitting in these meetings. United States, by the way, happens to be a member of this ICBC, at least at the moment. But even in the future, if there would be changes to that fact, then it's also possible to approach the members of the ICBC through experts. And I must say that as a policymaker, having served 4 ministers for 7 years, there is a very good possibility for researchers and experts to approach policymakers or the staff of the policymakers with science-based or practice-based argumentation and data. All right, then the next aspect that I would like to discuss with you is how to cut emissions radically in the construction sector. So this is no news for everybody. Anybody here? We've been hearing about this already a number of times in many wonderful presentations in detail, so I will not bore you with any of more of those facts, but just show this graph, which presents how the emissions from the basic consumption of construction materials are projected to grow towards 2060. And the IPCC, or the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has said that instead we should drop those by the factor of 80 or 90%. So the trend is opposite. Just to give you an example by dropping a few numbers of the scale of the issue that we are dealing with. If we just take a look at the production of cement, steel, aluminum, plastics, the emissions from the production of these basic materials that are mostly used in construction towards 2050 is projected to be in the scale of 600 to 900 gigatons of CO2 emissions. Now, that's an abstract figure, I'm sure, that it means nothing, it's just a number. But the limit for 2-degree warming globally is 1,200 gigatons or below. So what it basically means is that the consumption and production of these materials is about to eat either half or 75% of all of the remaining carbon budget, that there is up to 2 degrees of global warming. On the other hand, we could approach this rather depressing fact by thinking that, okay, if we in the construction sector can decrease the consumption of these resources and make buildings lighter, then that would leave so much more room for the rest of the mankind maybe to, make food or clothes or occasionally fly to the beautiful city of New Haven to participate into a nice symposium. So that would be our contribution to this difficult fact. And therefore, I'm suggesting that as we look at the evolution of building policies, now taking the European perspective, we should not be satisfied just with that we have set regulations that for energy efficiency of buildings, and we are just about to enter into estimating and limiting carbon, but instead we should go towards removing carbon from the atmosphere. This is also something that the IPCC is suggesting, that by 2060 we should remove around 8 gigatons of carbon with novel technologies that aren't yet in place and for which there isn't investments sufficiently in place. So that's something that we could probably do. And then as I was given a title to talk about policies, I will just... how does this work?
Keyboard.
Yeah, doesn't work either.
Try the mouse on the screen. The mouse on the screen.
Okay. That's how it goes. Thanks. So in the EU, we have 3 policy sets that are specifically aimed at this. Already on the top row, we already have in place something called the EU taxonomy for green finance. In other words, if somebody has extra millions in her or his pocket and wants to invest those into something that does good for the environment, and if that investment would be in the construction sector, then there is a list of technical screening criteria for buildings. And according to those criteria, you have to have a climate declaration for your building, in other words, a calculation of the carbon footprint, and you have to have some minimum amount of recycled contents in buildings. So this is already in place. And what's already been agreed but is yet to be implemented is something called the revision of the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive that actually mandates that every new building in the European Union must have a climate declaration after year 28, and after year 2030 there will be limits to greenhouse gas emissions of buildings. And what's also interesting is that through good collaboration with policymakers in Brussels, we were able to get through an idea that shouldn't we start looking at the accumulation of carbon into the building stock as well as a part of the solution side? And the same sort of policy approach is also resonated here when it goes to the construction product regulation and its recast. Now in the future, it's not possible to sell building products in the EU if you do not disclose the information about its carbon footprint. And then if you also want to disclose information about how much carbon is stored, removed from the atmosphere or industrial process and stored into that product, there are common rules for doing that as well. So this is positive in my view, but the problem is that the train is way too slow in relation to what are the needs. And the other thing is that the European Union actually isn't anymore a very big player when it comes to construction. Most of the new construction will happen somewhere else in the developing world. So that's why me and my colleagues launched a global call to action in the COP29, saying that actually within 1 decade we should have legally binding greenhouse gas limits for buildings in all countries. Of course, this should be done in a fair and just manner and through a science-based policy making. And if somebody is interested in actually to contributing to this, there is the QR code that can scan and then add your name to the list of, you can add your signature there as well. We are hoping to push this even further at the next COP in Belém in Brazil. So, but as a policymaker, you are probably thinking that, okay, if he's been making policies, then all the problems start to look like nails if the hammer is the only tool that he knows. But on the other hand, I am very skeptic about the market's potential to make the necessary changes in the very short time frame. So therefore, I'm strongly in the opinion that we just need to have very strong policies in place. The last viewpoint is the need to preserve 30% of land and sea area for nature by year 2030. This was a great achievement in year 22 in Montreal. It was an international agreement that led to this sort of intervention to halt the global biodiversity loss. Now, how is that then related to construction? Well, as you all are aware, we are using half of annually extracted raw materials to construction every year. And this stuff doesn't come from the thin air, at least not yet, if we do not count trees that are growing out of CO2, but it comes from the habitats of non-humans. Now, if I wanted to build myself a new nice house, maybe my dear colleague and friend Danny would be rather annoyed if I would go and tear down his cabin to make mine. But then when I go to forest or and start digging ground to get soil or minerals or taking trees, I don't have to ask the squirrels or the wolves or anybody who's living there in the forest for doing that. And when I'm doing that, actually, there is a contribution to biodiversity loss, and according to UNEP, this contribution is the extraction of raw material contributes to about 90% of the global biodiversity loss. Now, I'm not suggesting that the construction sector's share in this biodiversity loss would be linear, but what I'm saying is that we should be very careful and we should study more of what are the ways of how we can, take materials and necessary resources for new construction in a way that doesn't cause too much collateral damage. And I think that we heard in the opening presentation very promising examples from Brazil about that. But anyway, I think it's about the time that we start to rehabilitate construction sector from its material consumption and dependency on resources. And therefore, I'm suggesting as the third policy option that we should actually set a hierarchy for resource-efficient construction, where the most preferred option should be to do nothing. Just utilize the spaces that we already have and adjust our spatial needs to those spaces, because then we wouldn't be consuming any new resources for construction. The second most preferred option would be that we would take the existing spaces and adjust them to our needs. The third most preferred option would then be to at least utilize the foundations and the frames of existing buildings and infrastructure for making new, because these parts of the buildings are often most carbon and material and resource intensive. And the least preferred option should be to build new buildings. Obviously, this doesn't apply to areas where you need to reconstruct after natural disasters or after wars, and this doesn't necessarily apply in areas where the population growth is strong. But in areas where there isn't such a big population growth, I think this is what we definitely should do. In the European Union, for instance, 16% of residential buildings are empty at the moment. In my home country, Finland, a couple of years back, we had 1 million square meters of empty office space, yet we were building more offices. And this sort of like counterintuitive or even pervert logic to resource consumption is something that we should definitely, get away from. So if there is need to build new, then of course the compensation actions should be in the scale of the collateral damage that's inevitably caused. And how is then this related to material use and positioning of materials in relation to their environmental harms or perceived gains? Well, if we are building new or extending buildings, then I think it's relevant to ask that what is the best material for construction, and then we can compare these materials. But I think that we would need to go considerably further and upper the hierarchy to ask the question that how could we prevent the use of materials in the first place? That would be the best solution at the moment. And these sort of like a reduction of resource use, of course, isn't easy thing when it comes to politics. It's very difficult for the construction sector, for construction companies, and for architects or engineers to figure out that how do we get living if we are just trying to, not to do anything? Who's going to get paid for convincing the client of not building the building? And how does an architectural CV look if it's full of empty pages describing that this is a project that I convinced my client to avoid, so I didn't draw anything? It doesn't look much cool, and we can't show nice pictures on that. But the maybe harder question is that how do we get this through politically? Because if we are trying to reduce something, then that gets a lot of different emotional responses in the public. And it's like, as if not enough that I can't eat beef or drive my pickup, should I also not be given a right to build extension to my cottage or something? So therefore, we need to have very decisive policies and very decisive politicians to push this through. And it's been said in one of the latest reports to the Club of Rome that this is actually connected to trust, societal trust. In this report, it reads that when gross inequality grows trust, it becomes more difficult for democratic societies to make collective long-term decisions that cut emissions. Because the changes that we would need to do are very strong, and they will inevitably cause disruption that we all will see and feel. So the more there is trust in the society, the more there will be acceptance for these sort of dramatic actions that we would definitely need to do if we want to maintain the planet in a livable conditions for the next generations. So the three body problems and the three suggestions for that were that if we want to build if we need to build much more homes during the century for the growing population, then we should introduce per capita budgets for emissions and probably also per capita incentives for regenerative actions as well. Secondly, if we need to preserve 30% of the land and sea area for nature, then my suggestion would be that we would adopt a hierarchy for resource-efficient construction where doing nothing is the most preferred option and the new construction is the least preferred option. And thirdly, if we need to cut emissions dramatically, then I'm suggesting that every country needs to have a regulation for this in a decade. Thank you very much for your attention.
All right, we had 4 very diverse presentations there. So I think I just want to try to pull at some threads to connect these different conversations and pick up on some of the topics that each of you brought up. And let's see how we can pull them together maybe over time. I'm not going to do this in a torturous way. So, Mark, I was wondering if we could start with you. I wanted to see if you could elaborate a little bit, because it's come up in some of the other presentations the last day and a half of this social license gap. And I think probably many architects who are in the room and who have sort of waded into the wood space in some way find challenges in understanding forestry, understanding that larger supply chain, figuring out as they become more curious how to have their questions answered, and even knowing kind of what level of knowledge they should have. And so I imagine you've been in some of the rooms that I'm in where there ends up being a bit of this contentious turfiness, rather than having kind of a situation of co-learning and sharing. You end up with these pretty contentious situations of architects trying to mandate forest management practices, forest managers trying to explain what they do or not. You have policymakers getting in that field as well. But I think by and large, and I do not want to ask you to speak for the forest industry at all, please do not. I think probably most people would recognize that there's some issues around transparency and traceability. And so the question I have is really this, a lot to tackle with the social license gap and the social trust gap, but do you think there's a way to really get out of that challenge without having greater traceability and transparency of supply chains? And if not, why is there so much pushback to that effort?
Okay, good questions. So I'm trying to think of how to frame up a concise answer.
Sure.
So I've been in plenty of those conversations, and I would say sort of the most common conversation that I have with an architect or developer is just a simple question of, okay, like I'd like to build with timber, tell me how I should spec what I source so that I can be sure that I'm doing a good thing. I mean, I think most folks that are working with mass timber, working with biomaterials, most folks are starting from a place of wanting to choose a green material, a sustainable material. But then, yes, you very quickly find out that there are lots of different views of what constitutes sustainable, and in many cases for very good reasons. If you want to buy healthy food, you can buy organic food, right? If you want to make a choice in the supermarket that is better for the environment, you can buy something that's organic. You can maybe get recycled packaging, but it's not clear actually. There's not clarity there's not consensus on what constitutes sustainable forestry. Mm-hmm. So we do, and there's been talk about this, we fall back on certification systems, but there are problems with those, right? So there are certification systems. You can buy wood that is FSC certified. You can buy wood that is SFI certified. In the US, you can buy wood that's American Tree Farm certified in the US. But a lot of wood that is very sustainably produced is not certified at all. Mm-hmm. The certification can be complicated, can be expensive. In the US, most of our wood is most of our timber is on small private ownership, which those owners don't tend to participate in these systems. And so then it becomes an obstacle, right? I'm trying to build my building. I've got a lot of complicated issues that I'm trying to resolve. And suddenly, I'm maybe even willing to pay a bit of a premium to get good materials, but I actually don't know where to start. I recall being at I'm speaking as the developer. Mm-hmm. I recall being at the International Mass Timber Conference in 2018, I think. Mm-hmm. And there was one panel at that year on sort of sustainability. And there's a representative from FSC, I think, up on the stage, and a couple of others of us, and we started talking. And then the question from the audience came from the person from SFI, the two different certification systems. And it devolved into a debate. And I could sort of see like this room full of developers and architects kind of going like why would I wade into this? So I don't think that transparency and traceability is actually necessarily the answer. Mm-hmm. That's a big issue in forestry in general and in policy. The EU deforestation regulations focus largely on that. There are questions which transparency and traceability can help you answer. That just means knowing where the tree was harvested from, essentially. Mm-hmm. And there are reasons why that can be really complicated to manage, right? Thomas Robinson was talking about all the work that it's taken for them to be able to trace a majority of the wood coming into their buildings when they're working in sort of very developed systems with manufacturers that are investing and understanding that traceability question. Lots of log trucks are coming in from lots of different places. Wood, once it's milled, there's no way to trace it through the system easily. But even transparency and traceability doesn't tell you fundamentally what I think the preoccupation is, which is, was this sustainably harvested? Mm-hmm. Is this damaging natural systems? Was this harvested illegally? Is this driving a decline in forest carbon stock? All of those questions are more complicated ones. Mm-hmm. And I think that there are, to wrap up, because there's lots of other questions here. No. I think, first of all, there are some tools that help. Certification systems do help. If they're available, they do help. Depending on where you are, you do need to know a little bit more about your supply chain. But in the US, the US Forest Service the Forest Service lands are not certified. I would argue that they're very sustainably managed with high degrees of transparency and oversight. There are places that you can know that you can source material. But I think that over the longer run, there's sort of two other things that I think need to change. We are comfortable consuming commodities of other types that have mixtures of sourcing within that supply chain. And I think that this is again where I see the industry needing to take more action, the forest industry. I think that if the forest industry really can establish that leading companies are responsible actors, because generally speaking, we're not seen that way. That if we can sort of raise that bar over time, then it can lower the level of concern. It doesn't eliminate the concern. We need to accept there will always be issues within forest supply chains, just like there are within every commodity supply chain. Unfortunately, we live in an imperfect world. But I think that we can address what is, I think, a bigger obstacle to the use of sustainable wood than it is an obstacle in other commodity supply chains by raising that general level of social license, the general acceptance that it's possible, that the cutting down a tree is not necessarily deforestation. Then I think it opens up more space and greater ability than for us to source more easily with more confidence.
There's so much we could dig into there, but let's spread the questions around and see if we can maybe circle back to this a little bit. Especially, I would like to connect you guys on some of these questions of what should architects know, what do suppliers know and want to tell us. But I think maybe I'll go down the line a little bit first to tease out a few other threads. So Dave, the next question is for you. I found the talk really provocative, and I would agree with a lot of what you said in terms of the challenges of accounting, the tediousness, really. And I think you said the potential distraction of carbon accounting in projects, and this shift towards beautiful, seductive, more positive messaging to really inspire. The question I have for you is, I wonder, as an educator and also as a practitioner, how you think about the place that we're in right now, where, at least to my read, our intuition about regenerative building materials, about new ways of building, is pretty bad, actually. I find a lot of architects or engineers, they run a model for the first time and they don't get the result that they want. Right? The mass timber building doesn't look as low carbon, and they realize there's a lot of concrete in those footings, right? All sorts of things happen. And I just wonder how you think about that challenge of the sort of seductive, if we have too much of the seductive image without analysis, do we just end up doing greenwashing in schools? Or maybe more productively, if the iterative design process is really about designing and testing and designing and testing, how do we do that without testing?
Yeah, and I think that, so what you're getting at is anytime you put out a paradox, the point of talking about the paradox is to not pick one pole, but to actually recognize that the paradox is inherent in the system, and that teasing out an answer requires holding the poles in constant tension and not feeling as though, if I only get perfect data, then I'll solve the problem. Or if I only get the perfect seductive image, then I'll convince everyone to do it and I can ignore the data. So I think this is part of what to answer the question that I think you're posing about where I see the greatest potential from the standpoint of education is looking at a really expansive worldview as to what we say and what we mean by bio-based and geo-based building materials. It's not just timber, right? I actually think and that schools of architecture, professional practice, and research can embrace and needs to embrace invention and make it seductive, so that our prior conceptions of materials that we tend to think of being as old, as not permanent, as related to previous ways of building, can be not only resuscitated but reframed as not only necessary but actually a better way of building. Right? So the examples of straw are not accidental. Right? Tend to think of straw, 3 little pegs, and you're down that route. Straw takes less than a year to grow, 2 harvests. The amount of straw that's available now as a waste material, without changing any of the food crop systems, is equivalent to the annual emissions of the country of India. That's the amount of straw that goes into waste, literally goes back into the atmosphere as mass. We don't have a building material that uses straw without timber, unless you're using jumbo bales. So how can you rethink, and this is the charge to schools, charge to the question of policy to make it legal, is to think through how do we actually not only imagine new systems of building, but represent it in a way that challenges the conventional stories, the same gap of information between, we think, forests are great, but it doesn't have any of these criteria, because that's the story we're telling. So the representation is key to be able to transform the story in order to get to systems of change, particularly materials that are considered off limits, that we have to fold into the cycle and reinvent through collaborative practices. So hopefully that addresses.
Yeah, absolutely. Janet, I want to bounce it over to you to maybe make this link back a little bit to the forestry side. I really appreciated this two concepts you throw up. One of unblackboxing supply chains and how difficult that is. And I think there's a lot of folks in this room who kind of share that ambition and that project. But also, I really love this concept of biodiversifying demand. And so I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more. You showed a lot of wonderful projects where, to my eye, you're really trying to, either through students or in practice, unveil that larger system because it can help us design something different. So I'm wondering if you could, speak to that a little bit more of how you see architects or architectural education could be really engaging in land management or forest management, to some of the points that I think Mark was speaking to.
Yeah.
Well.
Yeah, totally. So a couple of things. The first one is that, I don't know, I'm somehow proud of the education I received, but at the same moment I feel very ashamed that, I was never exposed to basic things that today are driving pretty much of our agendas. No? So as somebody that these days kind of runs a research and education innovation institution, for us it's fundamental that, we try to, provide the tools for the next generation to at least know what they are doing, right? We are a very strange institution that enables us to take decisions very fast. We don't need to wait these very, very long processes of, accreditation and, 10 years into, making a change. So that's something kind of that has been really inspiring for us because, if we believe in something, we can, rapidly, change and be responsive. And for us, this has been one central one, no? Saying look, it's not okay that you start in kind of designing in your own abstracted space with very abstracted tools, prescribing and having decisions that affect other ecologies, other kind of people, labor processes, emissions in an absolutely abstracted, alienated bubble. No? So for us, everything that we try to do there is saying no. First of all, you need to understand the implications of pretty much everything that you do, but not in an abstract level. You have to do it with your own hands. So, our students go to the forest, understand why to tear down that particular tree and not this other one. Why is that necessary? Because our forest has too much and needs to be sustainably managed. And, from that example all the way until they open the door of one of the tiny cabins or the small prototypes, and they understand the implications of pretty much everything that they do. No? So for us, this has become almost like a new mantra, no? Saying the whole ramifications of pretty much everything that we do. It's morally and ethically super important to know, but more than that, it's a creative endeavor. It's super fun to say I could do a multi-species CLT panel because X and Y, and then all of a sudden you start having a kind of new palette of design tools that are super exciting, and they have been completely overlooked in our kind of discipline and education. No? So again, there are thousands of examples, and I could go on for quite a while on this, no? But I think this for us, especially in the last 10 years, has been extremely instrumental, and also you could see immediately the effect. No, we have many of our students that all of a sudden they say like, okay, I don't want to work for a corporation. I want to do my startup on, sugarcrete or into, playing with, sugar cane to do construction material with the straw. I mean, you see that the whole kind of like, paradigm set from the silos to the kind of this transversal value chain, kind of like paradigm I think is creating a very, very exciting, new profession for us.
Yeah, and I really appreciate how I think across a lot of these different conversations, even though they seem so different, any of these really strong binaries just don't serve us very well, right? I mean, I think it's probably an obvious statement, but we see it in sort of every single step of that supply chain of folks reducing forest management or not seeing forest management or any diversity of that at all, and kind of creating this sort of conservation forest, plantation forest, clear cut, don't touch it type binary, flattens our understanding or experience of those systems. And I also hear it all the time on the architectural, or hear frustration from folks on the forest product side saying, these architects just want, this grade of lumber, they only want clear wood, they only, like all these specifications they're building in, don't they understand the ramifications that has for a wood product system, right? But connecting those dots is quite challenging and maybe pushes against a sort of linear supply-demand kind of chain and directive. And it's very much the same in, I think, both the education side and the policy side as well. Matti, this is a little bit of a jump from wood, but since I think we have the time, I was just hoping if you could, before we go into audience questions, just jump, if you could maybe talk a little bit more about something you flashed up on your slides that I thought was very provocative. I think this world of carbon accounting, benchmarking, and then target setting can be very dry to most people. I happen to think it's really important. I noticed that you were mentioning in the global benchmarking for building project integration of social justice considerations into national level benchmarks. I know that's a big part of the UNIDDI, the Industrial Decarbonization Initiative for materials. For folks who aren't familiar, to be more accessible, effectively says we could set, say, a carbon cap for steel globally, or concrete, or wood, et cetera. But from a justice perspective, setting that same cap for production in the US versus in Europe versus Brazil versus India is really not ethically defensible. I was wondering if you could talk about how that conversation happens at a policy level, and what, there's so much to talk about there, but what brings people to the table? Like, what makes countries willing to have those conversations in this voluntary system?
Unfortunately, hardly anything.
Yeah.
So that's just my reading of the situation right now, because obviously because of the latest developments in the geopolitics. But then if we take a bit more like hopeful sort of like reading of what's happening at the certain working groups of the IPCC and the national working groups and regional working groups, then of course there is an understanding that definitely something has to be done, and you can draft several ways of, or there are several ways of how do you allocate the remaining carbon budget to a country and its sector and its sector's individual projects, say for the construction sector and for construction project and for 1 square meter or square foot of that building. So there are these sort of things happening, but then as we know that the population growth is strongest in the countries that have the least developed infrastructure and that aren't so advanced, say, in the access to renewable energy, which is still the main driver of emissions in those countries when it comes to construction, and where we do not have investments in sight for carbon dioxide removal from cement manufacturing, which is also just coming up because they are going to consume immense amounts of concrete in the future, as we heard yesterday. So I'm not an economist, but I can have a look. And my look is that it's been suggested that there should be de-risking sort of like mechanisms for investments in these developing countries, so that they would have They would have factories that could produce more sustainable construction materials, and investments with lower marginal interest rates for energy projects, so that they would also have access to more sustainable construction through these two channels. So to me, that sounds like the way forward, because if we are just waiting for incremental project by project improvements, that's not going to change the big picture. It's way too slow. Then on the other hand, I believe that, as I said, we definitely need to have a global carbon regulation for construction. Otherwise, this is not going to happen. The markets are not going to solve this. And it's great that there are advances in the developed countries, but it's not going to help anybody who are really facing the grim reality of climate change and its impacts in the developing world. So I'd like to actually get back to you and your presentation about how can we seduce, or what sort of how can we convince the public. And I believe that this could actually be building designers or architects or designers' superpower. Because as a professor, I'm, as you have studio critics, the students are coming and trying to convince of this or that fancy idea that, yeah, it's so great. And that's actually what professionals are doing to clients. They have been staying 2 nights awake, and then they come with something that this is so cool, and the client should buy it. But as we are trained to this through years and years of education and sleepless nights, why shouldn't we use this superpower of being able to convince somebody, to convince the policymakers of really investing into clean infrastructure and clean energy in the developing countries, and to put carbon limits into regulation? Maybe there are people who still remember when Steve Jobs went on stage and lifted the first iPhone. Nobody had ever seen it, but suddenly everybody wanted it. How can we, the designers and architects, how can we create that sort of moment to lift something up that's so cool, and sort of like a promise of a better future, that everybody wants to have it, and then the policymakers, they will dare to make the necessary steps ahead?
Shall we go to questions from the audience, if there are any?
I'll tell you that I tried using the app that we made you use. I'm very sympathetic to all of you. I didn't get to ask any questions, but we would love you to raise any questions or thoughts that you have.
Good.
Oh, go ahead, Jim.
I don't know how to have this group of leaders up there without really doing some provocative, stimulating conversation beyond what's already occurred. But and such a diverse group of leaders as well, brought together by Alan and Yale. We're out of time. There's this big gap. We talk about policy change, but yet what's going on in DC, the craziness, or all around the world, Paris Climate Change Agreement, it's out the window. How do we really figure out how, with 25 years left, by the way, and Daniel, I'm not sure whose slide it was in, which projected 2060, got to 2060, when 2025 or 30 to 2060, with that graph, are we really going to get to 2060 as a species? So I really just would love to hear some, reaction to that, if anybody's up for that.
And I think Stephanie said it before, there's 1 building at a time. I mean, that's all we can, at least this is what we are trying to do, no? One master program, one generation of students, 1 building at a time. Hopefully that this will enable, gradually, systemic change. We have Matti with us to do 1 policy at a time, or help advise 1 policy at a time. Again, I know this is not the best, possible way forward, but just simply, not doing anything and just simply saying like, oh, because everything is really, problematic these days, especially on the, geopolitical front. We should just be, waiting until a better moment comes. We need to keep, pushing forward with, the science we know, with the information we have, and, keep trying to show the path forward. No, I don't know. That would be my take here.
I think this gets, in many ways, to one of my greatest fears as an educator, which is the need to motivate through the projection of what is coming as the future. It's the sort of doomsday challenge. And recognizing that has to be held forward, but if there isn't something else presented as an alternative option, and framed in a time frame of not happening in the future, but actually what you do now, what you do tomorrow, what you do next, you can't know exactly where to go, but if you don't provide an opportunity, an offer, a way of imagining how it could be different, that future doomsday, which is very clear and scientifically defensible as our future, will in fact produce itself, right? And so this is where I think the impetus of speed, the need to be able to work quickly and to gather the resources that institutions like Yale have to not only hold this conference, but then to follow up and say, what are we going to do tomorrow? What will change tomorrow? What are the kind of possibilities and connections that can be made that we haven't thought about, or that got established through this room, that will enable doing something slightly different tomorrow that actually sets up a kind of visualization of a future. And I think this is critical to what we need to do, is the visualization backed by data, connected to policy, the intersectional relationship of all of this information, presenting an alternative, because in the absence of an alternative, we know what's coming. And that's the thing that, as an educator, the dominant narrative that I hear in schools and in presentations is the future that we're leading towards, that is producing a kind of abdication among students, abdication among policy members, a rejection, almost an intentional denialism because of the overwhelming challenge that it produces. So I think this is where I actually take great promise, that it puts an extraordinary opportunity and responsibility to make change visible. And to do so by not being certain of what that answer is, but passionate about the necessity for its change.
If there's one thing if I could have one wish, then my wish would be that all the presentations that we heard today and yesterday would be lobbied politicians. Yeah. Because the politicians are being lobbied every day by different interest groups who are mostly keen on protecting their businesses and their rights and their positions in the future. So there should be some planetarily positive lobbying by showing and convincing them with these examples that, hey, we can do good things and good interventions. And as unfortunately have seen so much, I've served 4 different ministers from 3 different parties who are very opposing, viewpoints to many things. And I must say that even the most advanced thinking and the most greenest parties still obey the rules of politics, that you have to please your voters, otherwise you will die. So that's just the dirty game of politics. So you need to convince the policymaker, the politicians, that, hey, it's safe to propose this because we have already convinced the public, and it's safe for you also because of this and this and this thick amount of data to go and to be vocal about that as well. So I think that we shouldn't be shy in connecting to politicians. I don't know, and really don't know how it works out here in the USA, but it would be maybe my naive European wish that if this information would somehow be made accessible to the politicians.
Maybe I'll come in quickly. Good question, Jeff. I think the first answer is, if we get there, it's going to be by muddling through, right? And I think, to state the obvious, it's not clear exactly what that looks like or if we're going to get there. But I think there's hope. I think a couple of observations. So I absolutely agree on the critical need for policy. And as an actor in the private sector, generally speaking, I love regulation because regulation sets the bar at the same level for us and all of our competitors. And so, and we need policy to guide private investment and private action. That's where all the action is, right? That's where the resources are. But without the right policies in place, then it will be just self-interested investment. We have policies around all sorts of things, right? We have building codes, we have rules around labor, we have rules around all kinds of things. The private sector is accustomed to this. We need policy. But also we need, I think one of the strengths of the private sector, one of the things that the private sector can offer is, we have evergreen investment vehicles that we manage. They have no fixed term. They're perpetual investment vehicles. That's much longer than political cycles, right? We always manage through multiple political cycles, almost always wherever we are. And I think that two of the biggest climate change stories of the last 18 months have actually been, I think it's Maricopa County, is that the county that Phoenix is in? Saying no more permits for new construction without an established water supply. And this is one of the fastest growing regions in the U.S., one of the reddest, the most Republican region in the U.S. And the other was, I can't remember if it was State Farm or Allstate, but one of the big insurance companies exiting the California market. California is the 6th largest economy in the world, exiting the housing market in California. It doesn't matter whether you're a Republican or a Democrat or believe in climate change or don't believe in climate change. If you're running an insurance company, you cannot afford to insure houses in California. And this is before the LA fires. Right? Those are huge, huge changes. That is to say that unfortunately we have a forcing function here, which is climate change. And regardless of your politics, the reality of climate change does begin to impact behavior. Whether we can get it fast enough, I don't know. But it does begin to impact behavior in capital allocations and private sector action. And the last thing I would say, in my particular sort of niche, the part of the world that I work in, as I said in my presentation, we work primarily with large institutional investors, large pension funds, endowments, sovereign wealth funds. And for the most part, there is actually some counter movement in the US actually trying to make it illegal to take ESG factors into consideration in investment. But for the most part, those institutions started acting and asking questions about climate, about biodiversity in a very serious way 5, 6, 7 years ago, in a way that they were not before. Some were, but most were not. And that begins to guide a lot of behavior. And so, no, it's not sufficient for an absent political project, right? We need that too. But action isn't stopping, just because politicians in one place or another have taken their foot off of the pedal or are not pressing down hard enough. So we need to do more. It's going to be muddling through. But I do see from where I sit, actually, a lot of progress being made.
And I just want to add one little layer on the education side too, at least what I see where I teach is, and I think there are maybe some students here, students are really angry. I think that social license, and I think it's I think it's a really constructive anger, actually, if it's okay to use that word. I think it freaks people out a little bit, and I think it messes with the power dynamic of a normative studio culture, for sure. But I think a lot these days about the same social license question is coming for architecture in a big way, if it hasn't already been here for some time, where I just think there's just a lot of projects, my personal opinion, that shouldn't happen. I don't think the architecture profession as an industry has a lot of good mechanisms to figure out how to run a successful, profitable firm and keep people employed and not take projects. So there's like a real incentive issue there, and a lot of people really thinking hard about that tricky problem because their careers and futures depend on it. The positive side is that there is an incredible diversity of what architecture practice is, I think, as everyone knows. And so I can't imagine any future where it's like architecture stops and tanks. What will happen is hopefully all of the more diverse and innovative and justice-oriented forms of architecture hopefully will finally get elevated a little bit more in schools of architecture in practices and in the profession, because there's a lot of incredible work happening. And I think that what's tricky is sort of the cognitive dissonance that happens sometimes in schools, and this real reimagining of what some people call the ethics of the brief. I think we'll see schools that move very far away from studios being about new construction, and also are taking on all these other topics like were being discussed today. So.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks. So just first of all, thank you, Alan. It's been a fabulous couple of days so far, and just invigorating for my mental health, I should put it that way. Just one comment quickly on Paris Agreement targets. They're tools, right? Paris Agreement is actually a pretty robust framework. Nobody's complaining about the structure of it, renegotiating exactly how it works. It's just how are we going to make it work in terms of political ambition and all that. So the key thing I want to mention there is just like everything we do saves lives, reduces harm. Even if we blow past 2 degrees and are at 2.5, that's better than 3.5. So it's just keep that in mind. Everything we do, it doesn't have to be perfect. Perfect is the enemy of the good. I was a negotiator for too many years for Canada. And now I continue to stay in that space as supporting the Forest and Climate Leaders Partnership. And so I'll segue to the work that group is doing. We have a coalition of 17 countries that launched a Greening Construction with Sustainable Wood initiative, COP27. No, 28. 28. Sorry, I lose track of time. 28. Too many COPs. And in the negotiation of the ambition statement, which is to essentially increase the use of wood in buildings and construction, with the presumption or the requirement that does reduce emissions and increases carbon stocks or sinks of forests, that we weren't able to quantify it because, and this is at a national government level, there was an attempt, we should have a target. What should the target be? Okay, well, how do we pick that number? And we've got, sure, we have Finland, we had Canada, the US, Germany, Fiji, Kenya, and even Japan. Nobody, we have current harvested wood products accounting as part of part of my negotiating history, that doesn't get us anywhere near the ability to create a target for that type of indicator. So maybe I'll just leave that there. One of the goals of starting it, even in the absence of a target, was to start making the work supporting initiatives that are working at improving whole life carbon accounting, improving the data collection, improving the material information about new materials that are in mass timber from different countries. So my question is, just generally, how close are we, do you think, for a national government to think about, okay, I'm going to have a target for how much more wood relative to other materials that I want to see in the built environment in my country?
At the federal level of the United States, we are at least 4 years away.
Very precise.
So probably three years and plus, but which puts the question, do you wait for the federal government? So you can't. So in the current condition, unless you have other levers into the federal government, you have to figure out other ways to make meaningful change. Because the challenge that we're facing in the United States is we have a government that is as close by denying climate change as the definition of evil, because it is effectively accepting the elimination of the human species as an acceptable outcome.
Hard to follow that, but fair enough. Yeah, I mean, so to the general question, I think, we've seen some target setting, as you're aware, like in France, right, 50% of new public construction has to have some wood targets. I think there's some, the question is not so much whether there's a target that could be set or we know enough to set a target. I don't think it's more whether the conditions are in place. To David's point, that during the first Trump administration, the U.S. Climate Alliance, the subnational sort of state governments stepped up, took a lot of action. We know that when it comes to building codes and a lot of the regulation that applies to the construction sector, that's municipal or state level, and so there's a lot of action that's possible there. I mean, I think it comes to a lot of the conversations we've been having here for the last 2 days, but I think the real question is whether, just where are there places where policymakers at any given level feel confident enough to be willing to take that action, right? And I would say that, there's resistance in lots of different places, as we all know. If it's not a widely used material, the construction sector, builders, code inspectors, everyone may be resistant to it. It's new and it's different. The cost is maybe not well understood. There are all kinds of limiters to it. And then, of course, the confidence that that's actually a good thing to do for the planet, that that's not going to drive deforestation or drive environmental degradation is part of it as well. So it is a complicated mix. And yet, we have seen, Amsterdam, the city of Amsterdam, the country of France, we've seen in New Haven, right? I think that there has been, if I'm not mistaken, you get a floor area ratio increase for building mass timber. So we do see places where politicians have been willing to take action. And I think that it's one of the places that we all need to do everything that we can, I think, to enable that. And I mean, quick disclaimer, I keep talking about timber and trees because that's what I know, but obviously this is just low carbon materials, generally biomaterials and low carbon materials of any kind.
I think just to reiterate a point that's been made, hopefully, really throughout the last 2 days is, to that last point, I think what will really, just in my opinion, really push that adoption forward is a real diversity of materials and techniques, right? And I think that a lot of folks are pointing to that it's not really a one-fit-all solution. And when we run models with a one-size-fits-all solution, they look super weird. Like it also just doesn't make sense, right? Yeah. We could think about building everything out of CLT. We could think about building everything out of straw. But what we're seeing is a little bit messier. Right. So, but I think that what I really appreciate about your question is that we are in this tricky space where you've got supply issues, you've got demand issues, we've got policy issues. We're kind of circling each other. And all of the actors would be greatly aided if everyone else would just get it together first. But in reality, it's just going to be this messy kind of all at the same time work. With that,
okay. I mean, very small one, just to bring, the bright side of the moon. In Spain, things are not looking as bad as here at the current moment, thank God. From this network that we launched 4 years ago, we are, all we're trying to do is try to push so the change happens faster. That's basically what we do. So, in Spain, just to give you a rough number, right now it's around 1% that everything that is being built is built with mass timber / kind of bio-based, roughly speaking. But for instance, through some of the work we have been managing that some regional kind of governments apply particular policies to build, for instance, 20% of every publicly subsidized building, a hospital or a school or so on, has to be built, for instance, with mass timber. No? So just to give you the other side of the coin, I mean, there are a lot of politicians that understand, say, if we have a huge forest here in our region and this is sustainably managed and we have an excess of biomass, why not to put immediately the policies? And these things, even though they are small sprouts in a desert, right? I mean, it's also happening. So hopefully, we would see more of those to come in the near future.
All right, with that, I think we just thank everyone.
And yet I feel a little compelled to try to tie some of this together. Feel free to walk out, I won't be offended. But first, I really, really need to thank all the people who are involved in this, because it is not a single person show. Although I've had praise heaped upon me, I'm one of the fewer players. First of all, the audience, thank you guys for coming. It's incredible. And the speakers who joined us over 3 days. There were 3 days, actually, of this. And incredible stuff happened on Thursday, and not everyone was able to join. Of course, our great deans, Deborah Burke, Phil Bernstein, Martin Finio, the students of the Regenerative Building Research Seminar, which did incredible work in the gallery outside, and the students of the Building Lab, which is an offshoot of earlier projects here at Yale. I gotta say, the guys on the communications team here, AJ Artemil and Ben Piacek, are stars. It's amazing. They got a lot of information out with very little time, which I'm grateful for. And I don't know if you've noticed how complex the digital support is with all different mics and different presentations, but Vin Guerrero, Trevor Williams, Dave Liston, and Mark Reno were top notch, and I really thank them. At admin upstairs, Terry Brown wrote you a bunch of letters inviting authors to come and offering them treats, money, and plane tickets. And I really want a shout out to the admin assistants who are actually the organizers of this whole thing, Charlotte Campbell and Max Coolidge. And then finally, he's sitting up there, you've probably talked to him at some point over the course of these 3 days, Richard DeFlumery, who is absolutely irreplaceable and who makes these things happen. So with that, if you could just hit the lights. I tried to put together really quickly. I got to stay with the mic. I tried to put together quickly this morning, because I couldn't sleep because all this amazing stuff had happened over the past few days, to try to put together a kind of comprehensive overview of what we heard in my effort to try to understand how it affects me as a practitioner, how it affects you perhaps as a building consumer or practitioner, how it affects us as teachers here at the Yale School of Architecture, which has been the host of our work. And I wanted to call it Reading the Signals from the Forest because it originally started, as Donnie said, as a biomaterial strategies, but we realized that biomaterial, as Steph just noted, is not really going to do it for us. We have to think holistically about all the levers, and all the scales that will act upon us. So let's let forest here read as the forests of human activity, the forests of materials from the technosphere, forests of policy, economic possibility. I showed this early on, and I showed it, the embodied carbon spike that happens at the beginning of the building life cycle, because it relates to the technologies that we assume, believe in, and that the other efforts that we've made haven't moved the needle as fast as we needed it to. And now we're really trying to understand the temporal aspect of this, as we just discussed. And Paul Anastos asked us really, is efficiency what we should be looking for? Are there other values that we can apply to this activity of building? Is renewable energy generation truly renewable? If you think that the sintering of semiconductor metals onto a substrate, which lasts about 25 years effectively, has to be renewed if we think about the material practices and activities that produce them. And then the fantasies of mechanical carbon capture, which still never, ever, ever, from what I've seen, count the embodied emissions that go into making the plants that would draw down about as much carbon as a single forest stand in the course of a year. So we're technological avid technologists. And so I looked up about 10 years ago when I was teaching building science here, the definition of technology from the Oxford English Dictionary, which has since disappeared, but I did capture it. I swear to God it was there. The first definition was the specific methods, materials, and devices used to solve practical problems, which seemed, we are homo faber, we're man the maker. And that's our species, that's our capacity. Like being our physiognomy, our morphologies forming from climbing in trees in the forest for our primate ancestors, our opposable thumb and forefinger give us enormous capacity, as we've demonstrated in the last 150 years, if not before. The second definition was the relationship of that technology to the problem-solving artifacts of our time. So this tricky relationship between problem-solving ideas and tools, and then finally the way in which and the degree to which technology itself determines a culture's practical problems. The stuff we made is now the stuff we have to contend with. And along with that comes a kind of techno-certainty that the answer to technological problems are technological problems, and I think we question that. And I would say that the things that drove material consumption in the sort of engineering era of concrete and steel were the brilliance of its homogeneity, its uniformity, its predictability in its performance, the isotropic behavior. It worked pretty much in the same axis depending on which way it was oriented, and this kind of lifetime guarantee that we're going to make durable materials that would stand forever, even though we were tearing buildings down 20, 30 years after they were built. On the other hand, these biomaterials, and again, trees are standing in for all the biomaterials that we might use as tools to try to address some of these questions that we've raised this week. This is a flawed piece of material in many ways. If you look at it, it's not uniform. And these flaws, which are really important to understand as both past understandings of vulnerability, but also potential reasons for using it, the inconsistency that makes it really applicable in many different ways, the unpredictability of the structure is something that we can address now through understanding wood science. The variability of species give us a huge array, a portfolio of different materials to use. The anisotropic behavior can actually be managed, the way wood expands and contracts differently. Hygroscopicity absorbs and desorbs water. That's an incredibly interesting potential to stabilize interior air quality, interior air humidity. Yes, it burns, but it also can be treated so that it reduces the amount of oxygen in it, and we can handle combustibility, and degradability is actually a huge benefit. And so we still operate under this precision fallacy. The idea that 2.57342 is an incredibly precise number and has some kind of inherent value, and yet it is not the accurate answer to what is 1 plus 1. So we really have to distinguish between accuracy and precision, and accuracy is a much harder thing to understand, and anyone who's ever done any machining or building knows that you can't put a 3/4 inch diameter dowel in a 3/4 inch hole. It's really hard, and it can't be guaranteed to work. And so principles of allowance, clearance, tolerance are used to understand error and how error actually plays into our capacity to make change and to execute things. And it might even be that driving a square peg into a round hole has mechanical advantages that we could use and that could benefit us. And so I think many of the questions that Paul raised are, how do we rethink our idea, almost epistemological notions of making? And then this question of wood and its application of wood, which Keel raised and critiqued, and Mark Palahi did. Why are we making, and Andrew Waugh, why are we making skyscrapers out of wood when most of the world isn't building those? But I'd also counter Keel's critique, which is that could CLT, perhaps not made in a factory in the Northeast, but actually brought from somewhere else, solve a technical problem of retrofitting, which is a goal of his? And could the incredible properties of a given formation of, say, mass timber be used to add stories to a building in a historical district so that we can get more density out of those? And these are maybe more surgical approaches to building. It's about retrofitting. It's about understanding the whole host of materials that will allow us to take advantage of the existing building stock that we have. And so we can add, in cities with very little land area, we can add more units of housing or more space for those cities without tearing down buildings. We know that industrial forestry is bad, and that means plantation forestry is bad. Right, Mark? Jamie Lawrence, a colleague of ours at the Climate Smart Forest Economy Program, told the King of Bhutan, we need to ask the forest what it can offer us rather than telling it what we want. And I think that's something we have to ask ourselves about every material that we use. What can it offer us? You know, if we were more like ecological silviculturists, we would be concerned about whether a forest, as we learned earlier from Sarah Keving, trying to increase habitat and biodiversity, trying to control pathogens, trying to mitigate wildfire risk, store more carbon in the soils as well as in the above ground woody mass, improve water quality through better soil management, control invasive species, or not, because that's just the new ecosystem. Remediate soils more generally because soil quality is an incredibly important part, and soil loss. And how would that happen? What are the tools? I'm going to reuse an image that Donnie showed, you know, that we can understand forest succession. We can also understand the different species that exist in forests, when we might optimally harvest them for a number of reasons, how much carbon is stored in the soil when we allow them to stay, or how much is lost. How do we move those products not into one uniform single product class, but a number of products based on the different species that are available at any given time in a dynamically changing forest cover? How do you move those into a building? How do you count honestly how much carbon is emitted in those processes and how much is stored in the building? Because without those really important and transparent assessments, we really are just lying about what we're claiming we're doing. And Keel talked about the diversity of forests, and that northeastern forests can't make mass timber, but they can make a lot of things, because over time, we knew several years ago, woolly adelgid blight killed off a lot of hemlocks. That could have been used. I walk around land in northwestern Connecticut and I see ash killed by emerald ash borer lying on the ground and decaying. It's a beautiful wood if you've ever worked with ash. The richness of these stands means that the different flows and fluxes of material in those forests offer us different opportunities to respond with innovation in the kinds of materials that we use, how we apply them. And every stand in every location and every region is different. We know that just from looking at the pictures. Douglas fir, black spruce forests, boreal forests, southern loblolly pine, Austrian spruce used up, dramatically overused right now for CLT that's being shipped around the world. And then these subalpine forests in Bhutan, they all look different. They all have different characteristics. You don't need to be a forester to understand that distinction. And the value of heterogeneity may be the new cri de coeur for us as we face this climate design. So I want to speak in a way about, I think, what a lot of people were advocating, which is kind of ecosystemic design sensibility, not ecosystem design. I don't think we can really design ecosystems, as Mark Palahi would say, better than nature. But we can work in a way that more reflects the richness of ecosystems and the breadth and transcalar quality that they reflect. We know about extractivism. We've talked about it in terms of material consumption. We've talked about it human impacts. We know about it from waste generation, but we also know that waste generation could potentially be a source for us if we could be inventive enough, and we know that buildings will in fact be absorbers of this kind of waste in this first iteration of buildings that we're building when we don't have all the other tools at hand, but at some point they will become material banks to absorb and transform waste flows. It's an incredible place to deposit waste. Instead of over biologically productive land, let's put them into buildings and figure out how to do it safely. How to take burned CLT panels from government testing, salvage them, make sure they're safe and clean, and reuse them in buildings, and teach our students how to do that. And teach them how to do true source analysis of the materials that are dredged out of construction sites and mines, what the procedures are and what the logics of those procedures are, so that they have a better sense of how their materials are functioning as units and assemblies and buildings, and what it means to have to lift that thing up, because that's how we consume energy. If you pick it up and you learn through making, you understand the material qualities, and they're more embodied in your practice. Yes, we need to design buildings as material banks and for as designed for disassembly, but we also have to develop scenarios, no matter how far in the future, for the reuse of those materials. You can't just say you can take it apart. That doesn't answer all the questions. You have to understand where it might go, as the auto industry has begun to do, as we learned from Jennifer Russell. And we have to make them safe to meet end-of-waste criteria, and we have to model our buildings as material banks, not just say they are. But most importantly, as we saw in Mapti's talk from Kiel, we really need to stop tearing down buildings. We need to call for demolition moratoria, not just because we like the historical aspect of the building, because we don't always like the historical aspect of the building. Sometimes we hate it. And we have to convince, because we're architects, not only do we have to seduce with the use of these new materials, but we have to seduce with the possibilities of how you might reuse a megastructure like the New Haven Coliseum, which of course experienced the same tragedy that the Kingdom did that Catherine showed us about. So the concept of biocircularity, of course, is at the root of this because of these potentials that it has for storing carbon. And we know that there's an impact across the landscape from Phil Misselwitz in the peat wetlands, that restoring just 3% through the kind of incentivization that Mark was talking about in plantation forestry, we can actually reduce agricultural greenhouse gas emissions by 25%, just by allowing these systems to re-wet. But we have to make those incentives. And we have the scale at which to make those changes and draw those kinds of incentives out. We know all about land conversion. We've been doing it since Levittown, if not before. But we can promote density, convivial density that is appealing to people. We can seduce, David, I keep using your great framework. We can seduce people with the possibility of really convivial, beautiful spaces and use very little land, sharing resources, concentrating infrastructure, incentivizing efficient mobility services, reducing material consumption impacts, and actually creating really rich social communities and getting maybe the beginning of what Indy was getting at. And then, of course, there's this issue of regionality. What is a bioregion? The upside is, of course, that we're really good at negotiating political boundaries, not necessarily collaborating across them, but we know where they are, and we're not supposed to, transgress them too much. But, could bioregionality really work? Could we create, through rich, diverse material flows, distributive economies of sawyers and foresters, loggers, and waste salvagers? Can we develop a relationship between rural areas and economies and people and urban economies? And in doing so, by tightening down the transport chain in the value chain of building, can we reduce transport impacts? Very simple. We can play a great role in that just by choosing to work a little more bioregionally, but also creating understanding. I'm going to give credit to Eleanor Ostrom, who was mentioned earlier, the idea that we have, because we're close to the resource, we have legible feedback information from it. Are we over-harvesting? We don't know about that in the Congo, but we do know in New England if we're seeing massive land conversion. And then finally, it's really hard to have system finance for system change if all you're doing is working state by state. And let's not forget about workforce opportunity in the city and in the rural areas. And then I'd say, I think this is close to my heart, trying to have expanded criteria for the kinds of pedagogies that David was raising. What are those criteria? Life cycle assessment, science education. You have to take a forestry class. You have to prove that you can transform a material from one thing into another and use it safely. And how do you handle these materials with the lowest number of steps that reduce the kinds of impacts that we associate with production? And how do we use them in synthetic ways within our buildings? Buildings are not just monomaterials. They can't be. They can be more monomaterial, but they can't just be monomaterials. And I want to know why a kid who's 14 years old in New Haven School, as a math problem, can roughly calculate the carbon storage capacity of all the building's material that he's studying in, And we can't get graduate students to do that or architects to do that. I think we focus too much on what I'll call point interventions, to borrow from a political economist friend of mine. We know what these are. Like we get investors to promote hydrogen steel, even though the bulk of steel in the world is made still using the basic oxygen furnace. Carbon capture. Oh, we're going to build a machine, as I said before, to make carbon capture. Oh, photovoltaics. We've got to just do photovoltaics. No, they're great. Don't get me wrong, but it doesn't answer the problem. It's exactly what Steph was raising earlier. And bioenergy may be the enemy to using higher value, longer lived products. We have to make systemic interventions, investment in natural systems, as Mark Palahi would say. We have to learn how to internalize externalities that aren't included in these very narrow frameworks of finance valuation. Lifecycle design, plus look beyond the life cycle of the artifact you're making to understand its social, environmental effects and what it might do in the future to some future generation. Think like the forester who's trying to restore the forest when you specify a material. Tell the true story openly and without shame, and publicize your errors wherever possible, and work hard to imagine that your buildings might contribute to policies that end waste. Paul Onassis often says we can't let circumstantial barriers get in the way of intrinsic benefits. What does he mean by that? Oh, there are all these things that are, it's really difficult. We don't have good data. We have all these sunk costs that we have to amortize, so we really can't make change. We use these analytical tools, so we can't really think about changing them or expanding them. The market's really new, so first adopters aren't likely to take this up because it's not tried and true. Well, architects do it this way, engineers work this way, and I've really struggled with my engineer because they don't want to use mass timber because they'd rather make steel. And then just people on the construction site or in your office who don't really want to embrace these changes. These are circumstantial barriers. The intrinsic benefits far outweigh them. Biogenic carbon sequestration, carbon spike mitigation, all these things we've talked about. Upstream ecosystem stabilization, which leads to downstream public health, that's well understood. Creating incentives for new investment in nature and creating new markets, which mean new employment opportunity at a time when maybe economic arguments is all we got, and that's not even clear. This is one of those things that Phil Bernstein would look and go, you're not supposed to read that. It's just to convey, it's the affect of complexity. But this was a chart we tried to make in decision-making, a decision-making pathway for low carbon or high, decarbonized or carbon-intensive construction with Matti Kuitunen and Andy Ruff in our carbon book. And we came to the final making easier questions because that was so complex. Do we really need to build it? I know it's counterintuitive for architectural practice, but do we really need to make it? Is it worth that if it means the future may be shortened? And once you've decided that it really is a valuable thing to do, how much? How much do you really need? Do we really need a building for every department at Yale? Each with its own auditorium, classrooms, office space? Seems like schedule management is a lot easier than building Rudolph Hall, but And then efficiency. Once you get past premise and sufficiency, you have efficiency. And we've already questioned efficiency. But we do have to try to think about how we can continue to use sufficiency at multiple scales. How many bricks do we need? How much elastomeric membrane do we need? So what are the next steps for this thing we call the global building sector, which is really a network of people working and making decisions, mostly based on convention. And that hockey stick that Ava talked about, basically representing everything having to do with the change from a pre-industrial to a post-industrial society, you can map anything onto it. It looks pretty similar. And I guess I'd like to put it into this temporal framework too, a different one. And we'll use carbon as proxy for all of these other impacts we've talked about today. And I want to give this little kind of history of that, which is related to what Mark Pavahi said. 350 million years of forest growth, not a lot of aerobic bacteria that was going to consume the dead wood, above ground woody matter, and it slowly compacted under geological pressure, geological temperature, and became, over 350 million years, the fossil hydrocarbons that then fueled an industrial revolution of such rapidity and such force that we're now facing the challenges that we do. Fugitive carbon in the atmosphere drawn out of those once forest resources. So what's this future going to look like if we're trying to reform the Anthropocene? What does it mean? Well, this graph shows the promise of a set of materials and techniques that are related to this technological avidity that I talked about. But I do think, and I learned this during this symposium, that technological zeal is actually part of how we solve problems, and that actually it doesn't just mean a material transformation or an industrial process or how far we drive it, but it's engaging all these other sectors of society which are required to make change. And we've been trying to increase housing, we've been trying to increase afforestation. For a long time, we've tried to reduce human poverty, and we've done a really lousy job. And we have an opening, which is that we've learned how to use wood more efficiently. Other bio-based materials will come and to follow it. And so we should use that, but also understand all of the socioeconomic, sociopolitical, financial aspects that accompany that, and also try to use those as levers for change. And what that looks like, I don't think any of us really know, but I hope it looks cool, because it'll do exactly what David's asked us to, which is to tell a story which is convincing, and at a large scale, as Karen Cito asked us for, that will help us to solve this problem. So thank you.